6. Okay, maybe I'll make an announcement really quick just about how we're going to wait 5 more minutes. I'll talk about that. Hello, everyone. My name's Kevin, but I just wanted to let everybody know we're gonna wait about 5 more minutes or so. We'll plan to start at 10:10 actually, as people kind of trickle in. So, just sit tight. Thanks.
Señor.
All right, good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Santa Barbara County Fire Safe Council's first ever Home Hardening and Defensible Space Workshop. Thank you for coming. My name is Kevin. I'm the treasurer of the Fire Safe Council. Been on the board for a couple years now. And this is, we're excited to start hosting more events like this and really increase our mission of educating the public here in Santa Barbara County on how to be more wildfire safe. So we really appreciate you all coming, those of you that are in the room, and we appreciate everybody tuning in that's online as well. For those of you in the room, if interested, we have some coffee in the back there, and we'll try to keep making that through the day so we can have ultra focus on these great presentations that we'll have. And just some other logistics. As you saw when you came in, the check-in is right there. There's a little raffle of some things that we got donated, as well as some kind of Fire Safe Council swag there. I think you get 2 free raffle tickets in your folder, so make sure that you put those in the little jars. We also have our small home model on the table out there, so check that out. Farther towards the back here in the lobby area, we have our home hardening guide, like a website, interactive website, where you can explore kind of different ways to make your home more wildfire safe. So you can feel free to go check that out. It's kind of our first test case for that. So we're looking for feedback if anyone is able to provide any feedback on how we could improve that more. As you continue more towards the back, the restrooms are on the left, and then you can hook around to the right in the back of this room past that divider there, and we actually have a little kind of immersive exhibit with some of the videos from that home hardening guide website that we have, as well as a large screen showing some kind of Ember Storm footage from IBHS where they test different kind of home vulnerabilities. So I think that's about it for the logistics. Hopefully those that are online know where your bathroom and your coffee is. With that, I guess I'll welcome, just to go over the agenda really quick too, we're going to have Nick Elquist, a wildland specialist from Montecito, give a short overview of fire ecology for the first 15 minutes, and he'll follow that with a 45-minute presentation on defensible space. We'll have a short break then, and then we'll have Dave Shew, a national wildfire expert, talk about home hardening for a while, and then we'll take a lunch break, and then Dave Shew will come back and finish his presentation afterward. And then after that kind of initial workshop segment, we're going to have a kind of mill around and check out the different exhibits that we have set up and the different props. Our staff will be around to kind of talk through that with you. And then from 2 to 2:45, Dave Shew is actually going to then talk about the future of wildfire insurance. And he's really knowledgeable on that, so I'm looking forward to that presentation. All right, I don't think anything else. So with that, we'll welcome Nick here.
All right, thanks, Kevin. I just wanted to start and spend a few minutes just to tell you about the Fire Safe Council, give you a little overview of the organization. Like Kevin said, he's the treasurer, I'm the secretary. We're a board of 13. Our bylaws allow us to have up to 17, but currently we have a board of 13. The organization really stemmed out of a local fire here. Now it's a California nationwide, the Fire Safe Councils. There's a hub, the California Fire Safe Council, that's kind of the mother organization, and then some counties have multiple Fire Safe Councils. We're kind of fortunate just to have one here in Santa Barbara County. We're the Santa Barbara County Fire Safe Council. But in 1990, many of you know, we had the Painted Cave fire that was really devastating, and it got people's attention at the national scale really about issues surrounding wildfire. And that was followed up by 1991, another devastating fire in the Oakland Hills. It was called the Tunnel Fire, and it really got the legislator looking at ways that we could potentially coordinate and provide resources down to the local level of wildfire mitigation. So in 1996, the Montecito Fire Chief, Herb McElwee, was kind of a well-connected person in town and also at the state level, and started talking with different local leaders about establishing a fire safe council here locally. In 1997, it formally was established as the Santa Barbara County Fire Safe Council, and it's been established ever since. Our mission's been the same, just to increase wildfire preparedness through education and action. And we just, over the last several years, several things aligned, a lot of funding. We had really bad fire seasons, as you guys know, state and nationwide in 2020, in 2019 and 18, and it really got a lot of funding available, and the Fire Safe Council was lucky to get several large funds. We got upwards to $4 million in funding last year for establishing several programs, and the state California Coastal Conservancy gave us a grant to hire an executive director. And so we're in the final stages of that selection process, so we're going to have an executive director coming on board probably within the next month, and hopefully they'll just continue to take us on this trajectory. There's a lot of funding available, and there's a lot of really good programs. I'd like to just introduce, they're outside, but our staff, we're really proud of our staff. Our first paid position was Anna Marie Parkinson, who's our community resilience domain. A lot of you know Anna Marie. She's the one that's kind of coordinated this and is working with the communities to establish Firewise. Kian Brower is our administrative assistant and communication specialist. A lot of these people are either graduates or postgraduates of UCSB, which is my alumni as well. We try not to be biased, but we do, appreciate our young gauchos. Yep, that's right. Kevin's a PhD student at UCSB. Gustavo is one of our community resilience associates. He does a lot of Firewise and bilingual, and so he does a lot of work with our local Spanish-speaking population and looking specifically to vulnerable communities and ways that we could potentially provide support to them. And there's a lot of resources that are becoming available. So I just wanted to spend a few minutes just to kind of give you the overview. The Fire Safe Council meets monthly. It's the fourth Thursday of every month. Since COVID, we meet online over Zoom. I have our website up. It's just sbfiresafe or sbfiresafecouncil.org, and all of our meetings are posted online. And then every other meeting, we have guest speakers that come in and present on different issues that we think are pertinent. On this last Thursday, we had Larry Grolla, who's a local geo-engineer about landslides, as we have this pretty significant weather this winter. So that's posted. You can see that right here under resources, feature presentations. We've had local ecologists and botanists talk about wildfires, and you'll find just a host of information. And then we also, just before I start my presentation, I just want to highlight, and Kevin kind of mentioned it as well, Ethan Turpin. He's kind of our creative specialist. He's not on our staff, but we get to hire him quite a bit. If you guys go in that back room, you'll see a lot of the work that he does with the Burn Cycle Project, and he has all kinds of different people that work for him to do kind of creative, artistic side of education, really. And then Christina McGinnis, who's a local environmental consultant that's developed the home hardening portal that you'll see up on the top right. There's a link on our website, and it's available out in the foyer for you guys to kind of experience a lot of feedback surveys that we hope you guys take the time to participate in. It's really developed for you all. There's funding to continue to improve it and maintain it, but we need your feedback to let us know how to do that. So we really appreciate you guys taking the time to be with here today. I think it's one of the first weekends that we've had sunshine. So make the decision to stay inside for a few hours with us. We appreciate that decision. So I'll get started with the first presentation I'm going to do is about just basic fire ecology and fire behavior. So I kind of give you an introduction about myself, but I started off with the U.S. Forest Service after I got my degree at UC Santa Barbara in environmental studies. I worked for the Forest Service for 19 years, mostly on hotshot crews and then middle management type positions. And then I've been a wildland fire specialist for the Montecito Fire Department the last 4 years. I'm the secretary, like I said, for the Santa Barbara County Fire Safe Council. I'm also on an incident management team as their fire behavior analyst. So incident management teams travel throughout the West when there's incidents, wildfire incidents that go past the complexity of the local unit they'll hire or they'll order a team to come in and kind of handle the incident for them. So I work with them, and then I'm currently getting a master's in fire ecology and management through the University of Idaho. But really the most of my education came, this is a hotshot crew out in the backwoods trying to figure out how to contain a fire. And when you have this task, you become very familiar on how fires burn and tactics and strategies that are most effective on suppressing these fires when you don't have many resources other than what you could carry on your back and what aerial support could provide you when it's available. So talking just about the basics of fire behavior, everybody's probably familiar in basic physics of the fire triangle, the three main components to ignite a fire and sustain it. You need a heat source. A lot of times in the backcountry, maybe that's a lightning strike. You need oxygen, which is often readily available. And then you need fuel. So you could think about maybe a lightning fire up into the high country at the tree line. It's gonna burn that tree until it burns out, and then the rock scree is there's not gonna be any more fuel, so it's gonna lose its source of ignition and just go out. When we talk about wildfires, it's a different triangle, and the three components of the intensity and how complex and hard a wildfire is gonna be to contain is the weather that's present at the time, the topography, and then also the fuel. So if you notice, the fuel is a component of both fire triangles, and that's the one component that we as humans can manipulate and try to strategically reduce and mitigate the impacts of wildfire. So here locally, as you all well know, if you resided here for a while, we have all those three components. We have very extreme weather events, our local sundowner winds that often come in the spring, like right now, which isn't as big of an issue because we've had so much rain. Could be an issue when it's a year like the Montecito fire. If you guys remember, that was an early season fire that we didn't have much rain that previous winter, so that was obviously one of our local problematic fires. But most problematic in the fall, because in the fall is when our fuel loads, our chaparral that are so necessary on our hillsides, right, to maintain that soil and that stability, but the moisture in there is very low, and when you get an ignition in the fall, combined with that weather and the sundowners, that's what really drives our most catastrophic fires here locally. And then the third component is the topography, and you guys all well know, if you've lived here long enough and hiked our trails, that we have very, very steep topography. Many of our canyons are really inaccessible other than with aircraft. So those three components are the reasons why our local fires are some of the most complex. To be honest, we travel all around the West, and I'm a little bit biased, but I think some of our firefighters are some of the most respected and proficient at their jobs, just because they have to deal with the most complex fires that there really are. Okay, so just talking about the three methods of heat transfer when we talk about how fire burns across the landscape. Conduction, so you could think about that as if you have a metal bar, right, and you're holding one end and you hold the other end to a source of heat. Eventually it's going to get hot on the other side. That's a good example of conduction. Wood does the same thing, it's just less conductive as metal, but you could think of it as being pre-treated. I'll show some examples of that. The second is convection. You can see those big columns that are coming off of these wildfires. Those are called convective columns, and that's movement of heat through some sort of fluid, either air or water, but in wildfires we're talking about air. And then radiation, and that's a good example is the heat we feel off the sun, right? That's radiative heat. So here's a picture of the Thomas fire on the western portion of Montecito as it's kind of burned across and down into the community. And the convective column is what carries those firebrands, right? So all that material, the more intense a wildfire is, the more intense a wildfire is, the more material that's going to be up in that convective column. We have those strong sundowner winds, and it's going to be dumping firebrands well out ahead of the main fire, and that's what becomes problematic. And that's kind of the basis of why we're here today, is we're going to try to teach some concepts on how to prepare your properties and structures so when you get embers that land on your property, it's going to not cause big issues. Oftentimes fire resources are out towards the head of the fire, either evacuating the community or looking to make a stand, and you don't have many that are well beyond We call them tactical patrols. It's usually less people that are out there scouting around, but most of the attention is going to be at the fire front. And so oftentimes it's not recognized until you see a black column on somebody's property, which signifies, a structure that's probably burning, and then you have to respond to it. So just those are the concepts of methods of heat transfer across in the vegetation. So you can see these branches, what we call ladder fuels. We'll get more in depth on that when we talk about defensible space. But those are getting heated through radiation and convection of that fire that's burning on the ground. So the more fuel that's on the ground underneath these trees, the lower those branches, the more they're pre-treated, the more likely that fire that's a ground fire is going to start to climb into the canopy and become more problematic. That also, the logs in the litter, they're being preheated by radiation and conduction. Kind of like I was talking about earlier, it's slowly preheating. So the more intense that heat source is on the ground, the more fuel, the quicker it's going to build and the more intense it's going to be. And this becomes especially problematic as it gets close to your structure. That's why we're going to be talking about the importance of defensible space, especially as it pertains to the first 5 feet of your home. Fences, right? Just like that log carried fire from one side of the log to the next and the next log, your fences are a similar thing. When they're made out of wood, they're conducting the heat. If one side of the fence is burning, it's going to act almost as a wick right there, and especially if it leads all the way to your home, it's going to bring that fire that was once out on your property directly to your home unless there's some sort of action taken to suppress that fire. Additionally, you can see that fence is bringing the convective heat up and lighting that pine tree on fire, which is then carrying that fire right to the roof line. And this is an example that Dave Shew later this afternoon will talk more specifically about out of the campfire. And they're able to go in there and study why we're losing structures afterwards and make direct correlations of the reasons why. So another really important component is the actual fuel and the components and characteristics of that vegetation. The size and the shape are important. I try to relate this to everybody that's been camping and tried to start a campfire. You don't just throw big old logs of oak in there at the beginning. Maybe you have some newspaper, dried newspaper that you rip up small, or you find some pine needles and pine cones and you get that fire established. So the size and the shape of that fuel is going to determine how ignitable it is and how flammable and intense it is. The loading, the amount of fuel on the ground like we've talked about. The content, the moisture content of that fuel. The chemicals, so some species of plants, and we'll talk more about that later, it has chemical components that make it more ignitable and flammable, and the compactness of that fuel. So I guess an important concept here is all vegetation can be maintained to reduce ignitability or vice versa, right? There's certain components and characteristics of species of plants that make it less flammable, but if you don't do any sort of maintenance and there's dead components of a fuel that may not be that negative in terms of plant ignitability. So the important concepts are you want to look to avoid plants that go dormant, right, in the summer. You want to avoid plants that produce excess litter. Eucalyptus is a good example of that. They kind of get a bad rap, but they're constantly shedding a lot of debris off the tree that's accumulating. Dry annual grasses and plants that retain clusters of dead material. One example of that is cypress trees, and we'll talk about that in defensible space. So you're looking for plants that have, just the opposite. Little dead material maintained in the canopy. Our local oak trees are good examples. Very little dead material in the oak tree. They'll let the litter go to the ground, but it's not maintained in the tree itself. Plants with high moisture content and thick leaves. So a good example is succulents, right? Succulents have a lot of moisture, cactus, and so they're going to be hard to light and are a good plant to have on your property, especially close to your structure. I have a link down there, and when you guys go and kind of play around with the Wildfire Home Hardening Guide, there's a Zone 0, which we'll talk about in defensible space, but if you click that, it'll take you to a defensiblespace.org website, which has a really good list of species of plants to use when you're looking at what you should plant on your property. Okay, so just in conclusion, just some lessons learned, and Dave will get more into this later, but this is just showing that second column from the right, all of our local, or all of our recent fires and the amount of structures that have been lost. And you see that a majority of them happened in my career in the last, 25 years. And we're seeing some pretty catastrophic numbers there. The 2018 fire, the Camp Fire, everybody's familiar with Paradise, where they've lost over 18,000 structures, and they had 85 fatalities. The Tubbs Fire was just the year before up in Napa, over 5,000 structures lost. The only one that's noted here within our county is the Thomas Fire, and it had about 1,000 structures. Most of those were in Ventura County the first couple days after the ignition, but we did have some losses in Montecito, but not nearly as much as they had in Ventura County. With that being said, there are a lot of examples of local catastrophic fires. We're a smaller community, right? So we don't need as many, or any structure loss, I should say, is devastating, especially to the homeowners. But we've had some pretty catastrophic local fires. The Jesucita Fire, 160 structures lost. The T Fire, over 200. The Painted Cave Fire, which I talked about. Sycamore Canyon Fire in 77. The Romero Canyon Fire, which was most notable because of the 4 people that were killed, firefighters. And the Coyote Fire in 64. One fire that's not on here that we had recently, it's a good example of it doesn't have to be a large fire to be impactful, was the Holiday Fire in 2018, which is in July. If you guys remember, the weather conditions that were present, kind of similar to the T Fire, but it was eerily hot when you have those days in the front country where it's over 100 degrees and windy, and you just almost know something's going to happen. And that fire was only 100 acres, but it burned over 20 structures. And we were lucky that it was kind of down in the lower portion of the slope, and there were some orchards around it that kind of helped to assist. But over 20 structures in just a 100-acre fire. I just want to give you, this is the T Fire, which shows the conditions that we deal with when you start to get structures that are burning. It's just a couple minutes, it's not too long. So look at what's producing the most intensity of heat. You don't really see the vegetation, right? The vegetation isn't really burning, it's the structures themselves. So what we think about when we're looking at community preparation is how do we limit structure ignitions, especially right at that wildland interface? Because if you could save the structures that are right at that wildland urban interface from catching fire, you greatly reduce the amount of embers and issues you're going to have within the community downstream of it. After the Thomas Fire, we went to Ventura County. We had a couple staff rides where you go and look at lessons learned. There was a couple off-duty firemen that stayed within their communities and were able to save their and their neighbors' houses. And if you look downwind, the neighboring areas that didn't have people there, that the structures burned, was almost like an arrow of where all the structural loss occurred. But because they were able to save their little cul-de-sac, when you look downwind, all those houses downwind were saved as well. So it's very important to try to limit structure ignitions. And it just shows you that, good on the firefighters for doing the best that they can, but it's pretty futile when you have conditions like this. Also look at the embers that are coming off and blowing when we start talking about the importance of defensible space and the amount of embers that are produced during these fires. These are wood chip piles that are causing a lot of the issues. People that had wood chips stacked up that were probably going to spread on their property. All right, so we're able to now look after these fires. We have a lot of structure data, and because of imagery that we're having, there's a lot of science that's going behind why are we losing structures and what are the components of the homes that we're not losing. And they're coming out with housing arrangements and what the components and characteristics of the homes that aren't burning are, and that's what we're going to be talking about later on today with Dave Shew. He's going to focus on that. It's also then directly tied to the legislation. So in 2021, the state amended their defensible space and created this Zone 0, which is essentially from your house working 5 feet out. And they're seeing that if you could greatly reduce the amount of combustible material within those first 5 feet of the structure, you're going to greatly increase the chances of your home surviving a wildfire. So they actually passed legislation, which is supposed to go into effect this January. They're a little bit delayed, but new structures are being built are going to be forced to have a non-combustible, ember-resistant zone within the first 5 feet. And then they're going to start enforcing it, I think, in the very high fire hazard area in terms of retrofits, or if people are remodeling their homes, most likely they'll ask for them to do some sort of mitigation. But a recommendation, right? There's science that's produced to show the importance of looking at those first 5 feet. And we'll talk about that in the next presentation about defensible space. This is just an example of why that's the case. So on the right, this is mulch, and it stops 5 feet out. Also the fence, we talked about the wick. They replaced the first 5 feet of their fence line from the structure out with a metal component, and that's not the case on the left. And you'll see how it'll just lead the fire right directly to the structure in a very short period of time. Obviously it's sped up, but it really within 5 or 10 minutes, a fire that's on the ground will spread, especially with some wind. And if you don't have somebody at your property itself to extinguish that, it's going to move it right to the structures and burn the structure down. All right, so our goal, as a Fire Safe Council and fire agencies is essentially to collaborate with our scientists, with our community members for these three. It's called the National Wildfire Cohesive Strategy. So essentially looking to try to make our landscapes more resilient. In our ecosystems, how we do that is prevent ignitions, right? There in the timbered landscapes, there's not enough fire. We've done too good of a job of fire suppression, so there's a buildup of fuel in our timber. But locally, we need to try to reduce ignitions. We have too many fires in Southern California. We're trying to establish fire adaptive communities, and that's what we're doing here in the Fire Safe Council, trying to work with you all to help yourselves and to give you the education needed to become more educated on how to make your properties more fire resilient. And ultimately, this helps fire agencies have a more safe and effective wildfire response. I always like to use this as an example. This is a home on Mountain Drive. You can see how there's clearance along the roadways. There's a nice turnout right there that could be used for parking or during an evacuation if there's too many people. There's a hydrant, right? A public hydrant that can be tapped into by the fire departments. But this is right on the wildlands. The Thomas Fire burned right up through here. But you can see as the Thomas Fire were coming off the hill in the wildland areas, it starts to get to a reduced fuel zone. So that fire intensity is going to start to delay down. And even if it does burn and throws embers, which it likely did on the home itself, the home is constructed with very hardened materials and the concepts that you're going to learn today. All right, so that's the end of that one. I'm going to go into a second short PowerPoint that's going to specifically talk about defensible space, and then we'll open up to questions and comments if you guys have any. So just give me 1 second. Security alert. All right. Okay, so we're just going to talk specifically here about defensible space and some of the strategies that you guys could implement on your property. So if this were to occur, your home could stand alone, meaning there doesn't have to be anybody there, you or firefighters. You evacuate when you get the evacuation order, and that you could rest assured that your home will be there when you get back. So the important concepts are home hardening, which is Dave Shew's specific, what he's going to talk about this afternoon. Defensible space, which I'm going to talk about now. And the most important thing is the more that you could have a fire-hardened home and defensible space, you're going to entice firefighters to want to stay on your property. So when they're going around, there are more often than not less engines than there are homes to protect. And so they triage, that's what we call it. Just like you triage patients, you triage structures. And the ones that look like they could park their fire engine, right, that cost $1 million, and their 4 firefighters are going to be safe to stay and protect your home, that's the properties that they're going to choose. So you want to make your property and your home safe and enticing for a fire engine to park there, because that's the highest likelihood that your property and your home's not going to sustain damage. So this is a great picture. This kind of talks about the concepts. You saw the video of the T-fire, but these conditions are pretty representative of our local wind-driven fires. The embers that come off of the vegetation, most importantly the structures themselves, are really what the issues are. So when you talk about defensible space, you could almost envision if 1,000 embers came and landed on your property and hit your home, you want those embers to find non-combustible material. And it becomes most important right adjacent to your home itself, less important as you move out. So flames, we'll talk about direct impingement of flames right on the structure, how to limit that, and then embers. So what is defensible space? Defensible space is essentially an area that's been cleared of vegetation, and it provides a space between the structures or the values at risk and the actual fire. So the concepts are to keep wildfires from impacting negatively your homes, but then vice versa. If there's a structure fire, then you want the structure fire to be able to be contained in the structure and not spread to the wildland areas and then move to other properties. It also, the concept that I talked about, standing alone, ideally the property would be able to be, you could evacuate and it could just be there by itself. A flame front can move through and it will still be unimpacted or very small impacts, and then we'll be able to send resources after, what we call fire follow or tactical patrols, to put out any little spot fires on the property, but the structures wouldn't have any issues. And like I mentioned at the end, the defensible space provides an area where firefighters can safely work, and you don't have to worry about damaging their equipment or their personnel. So what drives this is Public Resource Code 4291. The SRA stands for the State Responsibility Area. The entire state of California is broken into 3 responsibility areas. The state, which is CAL FIRE's jurisdiction. Santa Barbara County is a contract unit of CAL FIRE. There's the FRA, which is a forest responsibility area. That's the Forest Service. So those that live, on Paradise Road or back on the Los Padres, that's FRA. And then the LRA is the local responsibility area. Example is south of 192 in Carpinteria and Montecito. So as homeowners, you shouldn't see any difference in terms of response, because there's a mutual aid response, but there's legislation that kind of drives each of those independently. And they're all tiered off the same codes. But for the LRA, it's Government Code 51182. And there's also local ordinances, but all of our local ordinances are more or less replicating and using what's in these public resource codes at the state level. They all call for defensible space. They require defensible space to 100 feet. It's a little bit gray, right? Because we're talking about, other than the ember resistant zone, how it's kind of tiered and you become less aggressive as you go out. But, if you have a dead tree within 30 feet of your home, a fire agency could come and write you a citation to require you to remove that, and they'll reference this code. That gives them that authority. So the amount of fuel modification is dependent on the fire triangle that I talked about before, the fuel, the topography, and the weather. So there's also that gray area. You could sign up for defensible space surveys out here that will help give it to the jurisdiction that you live in. Well, they'll send somebody out and they'll help advise you on, you should take this plan, or this would probably be safer because you're on a little bit steeper slope, you should be more aggressive on this side of the home. Or most of our fires come off the hillside or blowing with a strong northerly wind, so you want to pay more attention to the north side of your structure. That's the sort of information that the fire agencies could help you work through. So this is a good slide. It just talks about how a lot of people think that their home has to be, totally void of vegetation to be fire safe, and that's not necessarily the case. You can see on the right side, yeah, that's a fire safe house, but it doesn't have to be a moonscape. You could have vegetation Obviously, aesthetics is important around here, right? Most places. Also, soil stability and soil health. So on slopes, you need some sort of vegetation to hold that soil in there. Oftentimes, privacy is important, especially in my community where I work. So you're always trying to think about how to, you don't want to cut all the hedges in Montecito, but you want to maintain them in a way where it's not necessarily going to increase fire spread. So it just shows you how you thin and you use specific species. You could also use the use of hardscaping, which you see on the middle picture, right? Pathways of non-combustible material that break up the continuity of fuel on the property. So if a fire were to start and is spreading, there's going to be natural barriers as it leads to your home. So as we move out from the structure, from 5 feet to 30 feet, you'll hear this lean, clean, and green zone. So essentially, you want to limb trees up, ladder fuels like we talked about in my slide about radiation or the methods of heat transfer. You want to create space from the ground fuels up to the tree canopy. A good rule of thumb is if it's a mature tree over 15 feet or so, you want to be able to walk underneath it, right? But if it's an immature tree, something less than 15 feet, you want to limit up about a third of the height of the tree itself. And that's what these right pictures are showing. The bougainvillea, which you'll see quite a bit, if it's not maintained, it kind of turns into this fuel that goes from the ground all the way up to the roof line and the eaves. You don't have to get rid of the whole plant. You just have to maintain it as such so there's some space in between that ground fuel and the canopy. And the same with, I think this is a toyon species right there on the bottom right? You're just removing and creating some space between the ground fuels and the tree itself. You also always want to remove dead material. A lot of times that's what we ask people, they don't want to remove their hedge, but create a couple feet of space from the bottom of that hedge and periodically go in there and remove the dead material and litter that's accumulated. Because as the embers come on your property, it'll get that leaves and litter established, and that brings the fire up into your hedges, and that becomes a big issue. So as you get closer to the structure, you want to make sure you maintain the property as clear of dead material as possible. Lawns, it all depends on the drought conditions, but lawns are a great heat sink, right? If a lawn's pretty much unburnable, you don't have to worry about it. So if you do have lawns, make sure you keep them well irrigated, and they're a good strategic benefit to properties. Removing the ladder fuel, so this is just showing oftentimes when you have shrubs underneath taller mature trees, you want to create that space. A good rule of thumb is essentially as tall as the plant is underneath, you want to have about 2 times that space before you get to the tree canopy. So ideally you wouldn't have anything beneath a tree or mature tree. You want to have about 6 feet so you can walk under. But if you do have low like ground cover or shrubs, you want to create about 2 times that space up to the lowest branches of the tree. Just the concept's right. It should be fairly common sense. If a fire were to get into that shrub, you don't want it to directly have a ladder into the tree itself. So you want to create some spacing. So we were just talking about vertical spacing. You also want to think about horizontal spacing, the amount of fuel that you have as you move across your property. So if you look at the left, this looks like someplace maybe up in the Sierra Nevada, maybe indicative of some of our mountain communities. But you can still keep your trees, but what you're doing is you're thinning them in a way that there's less overall density, there's more spacing between the canopy, and there's very little fuel underneath it. So if a fire were to get on this property on the right, it may catch the needles on fire, but it'd be fairly easy to suppress, but it's not going to get up into the trees and move across and be a lot harder to put out or have more impact to your home itself. And like I mentioned before, just the importance of maintaining your property, especially within the first 100 feet of dead material. Grasses, that's part of the ordinance as well on your property. A lot of people will do inspections come the springtime as our grasses start to cure out, and you want to make sure you thin those grasses. It says to about 4 inches, but you just weed whip them down. You don't need to rake them or remove all that thatch. A lot of times it will just mulch into the ground through time, but becomes way less fire. Both the flammability and the ignitability of dead standing grass is high. That's why you see a lot of ignitions happen on our roadways. You cut the shrubs on the roadways, grasses outcompete the shrubs, they dry out, and then you get some sort of ignition off the side of the road. So you'll see Caltrans that will be mowing the roads, and that's mostly just to reduce the flammability or the ignitability of our roadways. So you want to make sure as your grass is cured that you're getting in there and you're cutting them back. So there's 4 main zones to defensible space. There's the zone 0, the ember-free zone we talked about, the first 5 feet. You want to try to reduce the amount of combustible material in there as much as possible. The less stuff that could burn within the first 5 feet, the better. Science has shown that. We've seen it on fires. Zone 1 is from the 5 feet to 30 feet. So you're going to have plants, but they're going to be lean. They're going to be green and healthy and irrigated. And they're going to be clean of the limited amount of dead material. From there, from the 30 feet out to 100 feet, it's the reduced fuel zone. So you could have more plantings in that area. You could have maybe stacks of firewood, right? Could be in that zone 2. Outside the 30 feet. You could have some sort of, more vegetation is not as important if you have some sort of dead material or, if you have a big property or trees, you don't have to be as aggressive, but you still want to maintain it as free of dead material as possible. And then zone 3 is these access zones. And I'll have a slide specific to that, but you got to think of your driveways and your roadways that leading into your property as a safe evacuation route for you, so you want to limit the amount of vegetation. So if a fire were to start, you could drive through there and not have as many issues, and then also for fire resources to access your property. The bottom slide just says sometimes there's a need for an extended zone, so outside that 100 feet, that'll be based on where your property is, the slope, the amount of vegetation surrounding. Maybe if you're right up against the wildland areas with really thick shrubs, you may need a little bit more than 100 feet, but that's going to be more site specific, and the local fire departments could help you determine that. So these are just some examples of zone 0. What you could do here, local examples. I believe this is a home in Mission Canyon, using river rock and non-combustible material directly next to your home. So if you weren't around and embers landed on the left side, I'm thinking of that middle picture, it could burn in those little mulch, but it's not going to burn all the way to the structure itself. It's going to stop at that river rock. Using lawn, right, that's not going to burn. There may be a little bit of fire in those mulches if ember landed there, but the majority of that bottom right is non-combustible material, especially when it's right next to your home. This is just an example of how mulch is very conducive to catching embers. And so this is oftentimes what you see. That's just smoldering material. So if nobody catches that and extinguishes it, it could become more of an issue, especially as it leads, as you see, underneath this deck, which is wood. It could bring fire to the deck that will lead it to the structure itself. Looking at your roofs, this is especially important in the springtime because we get so much wind and it's leading into high fire season. Maintaining your roofs and your gutters as much of free debris and litter as possible is important. And then also what you put next to your home. There's a bunch of leaves that have kind of blown next to the home, stacked up some sort of material that could be combustible. You want to try to remove all these things outside of that first 30 feet if possible. No fibrous doormats. There's been a lot of studies that show, people like to use that thick wool mats on your front porches. Those are really receptive to ember cast, and they'll smolder, and then you have your nice wooden door. It'll bring fire right to your door. So if you like those mats, trying to remove them and put them inside if you were to evacuate during a wildfire, or think of a non-flammable material for doormats. There's also a picture showing patio furniture. The cushions on these are very receptive to embers as well. So we always tell residents, if you're evacuating and you have time to remove your cushions, either put them in your home or throw them out to your yard. But these will bring fires. Like if embers were to land on this picture, right, it's probably not going to cause too much issue on the wood. You would take a lot of straight flame impingement to burn that wood, but it would burn those cotton cushions and start to smolder. That then would be enough heat to generate a fire on that deck and cause issues. Also looking at your roof line and removing branches that are within about 10 feet. Sometimes it's why it's always a lot easier to plan appropriately when you're building your home and planning. Think of that mature tree as it grows in relation to your structure, right? But if you already have an established mature tree, trying to remove those branches as much as possible so it's not directly leaning on your roof line, and especially as it pertains to your chimney. The code calls for 10 feet of separation between the branches and your chimney. So the goal is to reduce heat and the movement of flame, pretty much the concepts. Remove all dead plants, grass, and weeds, actively prune the lime shrubs, relocate your wood piles outside of the first 30 feet of your home. Oftentimes you could buy a non-flammable cover, which is ideal, that you could put over your wood or things that could potentially catch fire and just take it out of the picture totally. Don't use mulch within the first 40 feet if possible, especially within the first 5 feet. And then periodically clean your litter and debris, especially as we lead into fire season. Move all gas and propane tanks outside of the first 30 feet. There's also code that calls for a 10-foot radius around your propane tanks of non-combustible material, so you could put rocks and things like that there as well, or just bare dirt. So this is just a slide that shows the access route. Code calls for 13 feet 6 inches. You want the fire trucks, right, to be able to drive in. So you want to lift your driveways. And then it also calls for 10 feet of maintenance on both sides of your roadways. So if a fire engine were to drive by, this wouldn't really be a very enticing driveway to drive up and around. You wouldn't know if there's a turnaround. But you could think about if you removed those branches, lifted it up, created some separation on both sides of that roadway, that they would be much more likely to feel comfortable driving in, taking a look, seeing what's going on, and then staying if needed. This just shows some areas of the extended zone where potentially you probably want more than 100 feet. That middle one I'm looking at where it's a comm tower, it looks, and a lookout, but just because of the slope and the fuel, it would probably need more than 100 feet to reduce the intensity of a fire if it were coming from the bottom. But I would recommend that if you want to do more than that, just call your local fire department and they could help you out and give you some recommendations. So you get asked this a lot, what to do if your neighbors aren't doing defensible space. We always try to promote communication. Sometimes that doesn't always work. Your local fire departments could help. Oftentimes they could come in and be very strategic. They're usually used to dealing with this where you get a neighbor that called and says, I don't want to make bad relations or my neighbor to be upset with me. Can you please send them a letter or go talk to them? And we could just say, we're in the area, we're on adjacent property and we notice X, Y, and Z. And you always start with trying to educate. Oftentimes we live in a community, people have either the resources and they understand the importance of doing these things that we find that most people are pretty responsive. So if you don't want to talk to your neighbor yourself, you could always ask the fire department to do that for you. All right, we're almost done, and we'll have some coffee. Eucalyptus gets a pretty bad rap, and I'd say from my experience, the majority of the reasons why they become issues is just because of the amount of litter and debris that they shed. But if you maintain a eucalyptus tree free of litter and debris, they're not any more of an issue as like a pine tree. There's conifer species that could be just as problematic, if not more. They have more branches. The pine needles really accumulate. So this is just an example of eucalyptus trees. This whole neighborhood, as you see, is burned, but there's not much flame impingement on the eucalyptus trees. So this was likely structure-to-structure ignitions. And the eucalyptus trees, the structures were more ignitable and flammable than the eucalyptus trees themselves. Coast live oaks are a really good species to have. It's a native species around here. There's been shown to almost be, they could block embers, and they also produce some sort of cooling and shading of your property, increase moisture around there. So maintain your oaks, but they're a really good species to have on your property. They also, because of the tannins, I believe, in their leaves, you won't see a lot of herbaceous material underneath it. You very rarely ever see like weeds or plants growing underneath oak trees. So a mature, healthy oak tree is actually healthy to have and when it comes to wildfire mitigation. So one of the worst species of plants that we see around here are juniper and cypress. They're very common. People like to have that Mediterranean Spanish kind of style look. They go with our our Spanish landscaping. But if you have one, or next time you're around, put your hand in there and grab and see what you pull out. They continuously shed their little leaves, and they just catch them almost like an umbrella. And all of that catches embers, and they burn. I was going to show you a real quick YouTube video of, if I could get to it here. So this is in the Bay Area. A lot of places in Marin County, Moraga, Orinda, they actually outlaw cypress. This is, I don't know why it's not showing. Sorry about that. All right, we'll show that later. We'll try to do it after break. We'll see if this is a palm tree. The same thing, palm trees, you want to maintain them free of dead branches. If they're maintained and healthy, they're shaved up periodically, they're really not that bad as any other tree. The issues are when they're not maintained. So you see all the dead material. These Mexican fan palms are popular around here. All that dead material brings a ladder, so if something were to burn on the ground fuel, it's very receptive. Think about starting a campfire. This would be something that you'd probably want to use to get the fire started, right? It's the same reason why it's going to bring fire up to the tree itself and cause really big issues, especially in high winds. People ask about artificial turf. Most artificial turf has a fire retardant on it. They usually put sand down underneath it. If it were get exposed to a lot of heat, it'll mostly just melt, but it doesn't really cause an issue. So artificial turf is a pretty good fire retardant and almost like hardscaping on your property. So it's usually pretty positive. When it comes to ground cover, no mulch. You want to use some examples that we'll talk about out front with the Santa Barbara Botanical Gardens donations. Native strawberries, succulents, things like that are really good ground cover. They'll retain moisture in the soil and aren't flammable. Rosemary and junipers, like we talked about. Ivy, if you guys have ivy, you can see underneath there's a lot of dead material. So just thinking about plants and species that are green and don't accumulate a lot of dead material. And here are some examples. And when you go to our website, the wildfirehomehardening.org, you'll see a lot of good examples in that Zone 0 on the Defensible Space page. These are on the no-go list. Sages, which people like, they're often native, but if they're not maintained free of dead material, they'll go dormant in the summer and they become very flammable. So this is the last slide here, just looking at some concepts that we've learned this morning. What can you guys see on this that could potentially be issues if a wildfire were on the property? Ladder fuels? Yeah, the wooden deck. That's probably the main thing, right? And that's what Dave's going to talk about this afternoon, is the flammable decks. But you could see how the grass would be a good barrier, but embers could land within that Zone 0, start some of those plants on fire. There's a window, which looks like, you know, the home is probably old enough to have single pane. So you could maintain this, remove the fuel away from the window, lighten up the amount of plantings and the continuity, use some sort of hardscaping such as gravel. And then we'll talk about later what Dave Shew's going to talk about is the decks and actually the structure itself. All right, sorry that was a little bit long there towards the end, but do you guys have any questions? Jim?
Thanks. That's great. Oaks, the litter all the oak leaves really, that keep things from growing. Is that a problem usually, or only if the wind blows them around, or what?
Can you repeat the question for people on?
Oh yeah, so the question is
Repeat the question.
yep, oak leaves, if there are issues, especially when it's windy. Usually what we tell, I mean, the leaves, it's kind of a balance between soil retention and wildfire mitigation, right? Oak leaves are good at maintaining that soil, having some sort of adding organic material. But we usually, if it's if it's left too long without maintenance, it could really get a pretty big duff layer. So we, periodically, when you're doing your springtime, getting ready for the high fire season, just periodically removing some of that, not all of it. And a lot of it is situational dependent, how close it is to your structure. Maybe sometimes we ask people just to blow all their oak leaves away from their home. You don't actually have to pile it up and throw them away, but blow it away from more of the structures and the values that you don't want to have fire if you were to have a fire on the property. So it's mostly situational dependent, but oaks overall, the flame lengths off oak litter is going to be relatively small. You just don't want a continuous path of oak leaves leading up to your home or your shed or something that's going to be problematic.
Okay, and similar with sycamore, or, a lot of junk in there.
Yeah, it's a similar concept, just the dry leaves on sycamores. A lot of times they're thicker and they're broader leaves, so there'll be more moisture underneath it. But still, they could pile up quite a bit because they could be pretty messy species of trees. So just being more mindful of breaking up the continuity of the litter on your property, I would say. Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, I was wondering about this defensible space. If you had a home on the mesa or closer to the ocean, or like a house in Summerlin, but it's down near Lily Avenue and not up high, do you have to use these exact rules for defensible space if you're planting a landscape? I would definitely honor the 5 foot, but I'm wondering, when you're in a somewhere where it would be unlikely for the fire to burn all the way up onto the mesa or something like that.
Yeah, I think the main thing is to think about like embers, right? Is the further you get away from the wildland areas, the less likely you're going to have a continuous flame front that's going to move from the wildlands through the urban area to your property. So think about if you were to get a bunch of embers casted on your property, you want to pay the most attention and be the most aggressive right at your home, the zone 0, within that first 5 feet. And then you don't necessarily have to be as aggressive as you move out in an urban environment, if that makes sense. And just think about where you place, stacks of wood or flammable material, the doormats. It's more of the things that could potentially catch fire that are right near your home from embers, not a direct flame front that's going to move down, because it's probably less likely that's going to occur in those areas. Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
There's a type of euphorbia that grows into a big tree, and one variety of it is called sticks on fire, and the other is green, and it's just like little, fingers. The leaves are kind of like
Pencil, yeah.
pencil. Do you have the name of it?
Euphorbia, it's pencil tree.
Pencil
See it
tree.
everywhere.
Yeah.
And the sap, is an irritant to the skin and can harm your eyes and such. And I use it on the property that I take care of because the deer won't eat it, the gophers won't eat it, doesn't need any water. But I worry about firefighters if it starts to melt because of the intense heat. Is that going to be bad for them to breathe?
Yeah. So there's a species of I don't
Euphorbia.
euphorbia.
It's a milky sap.
It's a native, I assume? No, it has a milky sap, and it has when it burns, it could potentially be an irritant, is what you're saying?
Yeah, to the eyes, but for also the breathing.
Yeah, a lot of plants, to be honest, will be irritants if you breathe it. Any smoke at high concentrations. So I don't know. I'd have to look specifically at that. It's more of the how much you're putting in a property. Species, if you plant in patchiness, aren't as big of issues, right? Because it's not continuous. Firefighters could work around it. But if you have a continuous patch of vegetation that's going to put out some sort of irritant smoke, it's really hard to get out of it. But there's usually wind, and we're fairly strategic in how you could access things like that. Access it from upwind, and it's not as big of an issue. I don't know about the flammability and things of that specific plant, so I can't really address that. It melts.
It's very succulent-like, so.
Yeah, so it sounds like it could be okay.
Yeah. You guys have to deal with poison oak and the structure burning and off-gassing and different things, so I'm sure you're wearing respirators.
Yeah, during structure fires, yes. Wildland firefighters, most often because they're hiking around and doing more physical exertion and there's less hazards, although they're starting to do more tests on it, but they don't carry all the gear. It's different gear during wildland fires. Yeah. Thanks. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, I'm curious to know how much you all work with the city, specifically the architectural review board. I was replacing a simple deck and I wanted to replace the wooden rail with metal. And thousands of dollars later, with an architect, over a year fighting the city, they would not let me use metal railing. And I live one house away from the high fire zone. The city is just ridiculous that they don't consider this. They fought me on even using AZEK TimberTech, which is less flammable than actual wood for the decking material. But I'm interested, they really need to be educated on stuff like this. And is there any sort of coordination with you all?
Yeah, that's a good question. We're trying to improve it. There's certain building retrofits and things that require a permit that goes through the fire department. It's called FPC's, Fire Protection Certificate. But that's mostly like sprinklers, roofs, things of that nature that are a little bit larger in size. I agree with you, there probably needs to be more coordination, and I think it's becoming more attention, as more attention's given to wildfires, I think that people will pay more attention, and hopefully, I think it's just government, to be honest, that oftentimes are siloed, and people are very focused on their silo and their area of expertise. I'll ask, I know our policies for Montecito, but it's a district, and there's permits for certain buildings,
Yeah, my deck requires a permit and I, follow the law and, but I should just do what all my other neighbors do and not get a permit. It's just the way people do it because they're so ridiculous.
Yeah, that seems weird.
They would not listen at all that I was trying to create, something that wouldn't be so flammable. City fire will be related to a lot of that.
Yeah, and I would ask, I mean, they would be more than happy to, they have those relationships established and they could probably make that connection and remedy the situation for you. Yep. All right, thank you, Anna Marie. I liked it better when Robbie came.
Well, you know how he is. He interjects stuff. Well, this is PowerPoint. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
You know, he just starts telling stories as he goes, kind of thing. It's a tough one, though. The way he set it up, I could see like.
Yeah, yeah.
All right, everybody, we're gonna get started with part 2 of our workshop today about home hardening. So we have a guest speaker with us today, Dave Shew, retired CAL FIRE staff chief. He'll be talking to us about that. We're a little behind schedule as usual, so we'll probably take lunch around 12:15. So if you guys had a good snack, so I'll let Dave get started. You're on.
I'm on. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for showing up on this beautiful Saturday morning. This is really wonderful. I live up in Napa, California, and it's been so cold and wet up there, and so I'm happy to see some sunshine now. So good morning. I'm here to talk to you about the same thing that we've all been talking about, is home hardening, defensible space. A lot of the comments that you heard from Nick, I'm going to be reviewing and talking about in addition to what they said, but I'm going to be putting a little bit different context to it. What I'm going to be sharing with you is talking a lot about the science and the research behind why we're telling people to do what we're telling them. None of this is being created in a vacuum or by just people guessing about what's going on. And so I've got a fairly extensive PowerPoint to put together. We could spend a full day doing this, but we're going to try to condense it into just an hour or two. So let's go ahead and get started, if I can do this. So just a little background on myself. I retired from CAL FIRE in 2018. I was a staff chief in Sacramento working for the Office of the State Fire Marshal, and I had this wonderful title called the Chief of Planning and Risk Analysis, that I was working with the Board of Forestry for the Strategic Fire Plan for the state of California. Yes, there is one. And I was also overseeing the defensible space inspection programs and a lot of the prevention works that CAL FIRE and the state was doing. I kind of jokingly said that by 2017 and 18, when all the bad fires were starting to really crop up, I figured that I was in charge of all the prevention stuff and I was clearly failing miserably at my job, so I really needed to leave. But I worked for 11 years as the public information officer on one of our state's incident management teams, which took me to large emergency incidents all over the state. I worked as the fire marshal in Napa County, where I still live, and just went to lots and lots of fires. But my odd background is that I'm also a licensed architect, that I started my life as an architect and became involved as a volunteer firefighter at a small community up on the North Coast. Has anybody ever heard of the Sea Ranch up on the Sonoma coast? So I moved up there to work with an architect who happened to be the volunteer fire chief there. And I thought that looked fun. So I became a volunteer firefighter, and that led to a 32-year career with CAL FIRE. So I come to this space with a little bit different perspective than most people, because I've got that background in architecture, design, land use planning, construction, building materials and such, and then 32 years of wildfire experience. And those two worlds have literally just collided in spades at this point. So my whole role in my failure in retirement is to continue working on this project and try to find ways to really reduce the number of structures from igniting during a wildfire. And that's what this whole talk is about, is that wildfires are a natural part of the environment. We need to allow wildfire to continue to burn, but we don't want it to take all our homes and communities and entire towns away. So there are things that we're learning, and that's what we're going to be talking about today, is what the science and research is telling us about and how we're going to move forward with that. It's also not just a California problem. All of you are familiar with the, literally, I think it was 46 million acres that burned just a couple of years ago in Australia. There's numerous fires all over the planet. There were, a couple of years ago, there were multiple fatalities in Greece, and probably many of you saw on the news, literally families driving to the edge of the Mediterranean, jumping in the water just to escape the flames, and things like this. There's fires right now this year. It's summertime down in the South America, and Argentina and Chile are being hit very, very hard. They're having one of their worst fire seasons they've ever had. In fact, just a couple of weeks ago, there was one of the largest wildfires that has ever occurred in the country of Ireland, if you can believe that. So these fires are occurring across the globe. They're even beginning to see fire ignitions in the tundra areas in Siberia and things like this. Finland and Sweden have had some of the worst fires in their northern reaches of their pine forests and things that we've ever seen. So this is a growing problem across the globe. And so we need to try to get a handle on that. And there's a lot of researchers from all over the world, in Australia, South America, Europe, in the United States and Africa and all over the place, that are all working on coming up with these solutions. And a lot of the information that I'm bringing you today is sort of a compilation of all of that research that's being done across the globe. So that's what we're going to be talking about. We're going to be talking about some of the history and how we got to where we are today, why it's happening. You've already heard some of the wildfire basics, so we'll go through that very, very quickly. We're going to talk about the fire hazard severity zones and response areas, and again, the wildfire research, mitigation methodology, and tying that all into home hardening, defensible space, and all those kind of things, and how we can use the research and the science that we're learning to better protect our properties and our homes and our communities as all of this moves forward. So let's move right into a history of wildfire. Where did it come from? Why are we where we are today? California is a very natural wildfire environment. Wildfires have been a part of the natural ecosystem here in California for millenniums, long before anyone ever lived here. Native Americans and indigenous people who were living here for thousands of years before European settlers arrived used wildfire and saw it as a partner. They actually didn't ever think of wildfires as being a bad thing or an enemy that they needed to fight. It wasn't until European settlers started coming out west and the United States was growing back in the 1800s. And we all know what triggered the mass movement into California, of course. It was in 1849 during the gold rush. So then, after that, all these people that moved out here, there started being more companies coming out doing timber harvesting. Of course, the railroads were invented and railroads started moving out west. Lots of industry and things like that. And of course, a lot of these businesses back in the 1800s were actually the cause of a lot of fires. They're the ones that were actually starting to cause fires. Previous to all of this, it was all natural. Lightning strikes, things like that were occurring. And wildfires continued to burn on a very, very regular pace across the western United States very, very frequently. And it kept everything kind of cleaned out. When you look at that park-like setting in that lower slide there, that's what a lot of the native landscape looked like prior to the settlement and everything happening. So when all of these railroads and businesses were coming out here, fires were continuing to happen. Largely, a lot of them caused by the work that they were doing, but it was really hampering their business. And as business people and large corporations were growing, they really started getting upset at wildfires. And along towards the late 1800s, people were getting really frustrated with the wildfire situation, and they literally started thinking about the fact that we need to do something about it. And then we fast forward into the 20th century, and in 1910, that was the year that changed everything. 1910 saw a raft of fires across the entire western United States. Several million acres burned that year, with smoke and ash that traveled across the country and were affecting New York City and Washington, D.C. and things like this. We've seen that happen recently, just in recent fires that we've had over the last few years. But it occurred back in 1910, and it was almost like that was the straw that broke the camel's back. They said, we really don't like fire. We need to put it out. And we got really, really good at putting fires out. And we largely eliminated wildfire from the landscape. And what ended up happening is that when you take the fire away from the landscape, what happens? All the vegetation starts growing. So what ends up happening is that now we create this unnatural environment that wildfire is not a part of any longer. And so we started building all these policies. Back in 1935, the Forest Service created what is known as the 10 a.m. policy, which is still kind of used today. The 10 a.m. policy basically says that whenever a wildfire starts, we want to largely have it under control by 10 a.m. the following day. Because back then, they were using the nighttime to really fight. Fires didn't explode and burn at the intensity that they do today during the nighttime. That wasn't typical back then. But now today, these policies are still kind of guiding a lot of our firefighting principles and things like that. In California, CAL FIRE created the state forester position in 1905. The Board of Forestry was actually created in 1885 to start dealing with all the timber harvesting and all the forestry issues that were taking place across the state. In 1911, right on the heels of that large fire event in 1910, the Weeks Act established funding for state fire suppression. Again, there was this idea that we should fight fires and put them all out. In fact, if we really look at it today, it's an anomaly. If you think of natural disasters, wildfire is the only one that we even think about, even talk about in terms of something that we have control over, something that we can fight, a battle or a war that we can win. We don't go out and fight hurricanes. We don't fight tornadoes. We don't fight floods, but we're still fighting wildfires as if it were some kind of an enemy or a battle that we can fight and win. And we're not winning right now. It's really overcoming us. And CAL FIRE still has a policy that 95% of every ignition in the state will be kept at 10 acres or less. And they meet that requirement, actually even exceed it most of the time. Most of the time, and on an average given year, probably 96, 7, maybe even as high as 98% of the fires are kept at 10 acres or less. But today, we know it's that 2, 3, 4% that are not being kept at 10 acres that are really causing us a lot of problem. So we have to study and learn from why these things are happening and what's going on. These are historical photos that were all taken in the exact same location over the period of about 80 years. They happen to be up in Montana, but they literally could be any place in the Sierra Nevadas or any place in the western United States, quite frankly. If you look at the picture on the left, you can see some evidence of some timber harvesting and things, but for the most part, that landscape was kept very open and clear like that because of routine fires that almost always burn through those landscapes. In 1910, after the fires and our decisions to put fires out, you started seeing this growth. In 1958 and then in 89, you see this massive increase in vegetation that would have never existed prior to the 20th century. And a lot of people have asked me before, they say, I've always wondered, how did the wagon trains and things make it through all that dense brush like that to come out for the gold rush and such? The simple answer was, it didn't exist. If you lived back in 1849, it would have looked like the picture on the left. And those, wagon trains and tourists and people can easily drive through that, but not any longer. And so we don't have any collective idea or memory except from photographs about what it used to look like before we became very aggressive at removing wildfire from the environment. And so today we have these explosive growths. Now I'm going to show a couple videos here. How many of you have heard, this is a photograph taken from one of CAL FIRE's helicopters during the Carr fire that burned in 2018, just before the Camp Fire. This is the Carr fire that occurred in Shasta County up just on the west side of Redding. And this is the tornado that everybody probably heard about, the famous fire tornado that blew up, and here's what it looked like. There's no audio to this, but you can see the swirling flames. And you can see just the strength. I mean, we know what tornadoes, did everybody see the news this morning about the horrible tornadoes in Alabama and Mississippi and such? That's what occurred in Shasta County, except instead of just wind and hail and things blowing around, it was fire. And it flipped over cars, it tore down buildings, all these kinds of things. So that's the conditions that we're seeing more and more of. Now, fire tornadoes and fire whirls have been things that have existed in fire landscapes for a long, long time. But to see them on this scale is new. We haven't seen this kind of explosive growth. This is another video I want you to pay attention to. This is the morning that the campfire erupted. This is a video that was taken by one of the first firefighters who arrived at scene, and this is the condition that they were in. That is what the wind was doing the morning that the campfire started. So you can see why those fires immediately blew up like that. When you have wind events that are becoming more and more common, and probably all of you have been in wind events that are very, very high, right? If you put an ignition source and pair it with that kind of a wind event, there's simply nothing that we have available to us in our human arsenal at all. This notion that we can go out and fight that as a fire is impossible. We don't have tools, we don't have equipment, we don't have people who can fight anything like that if an ignition starts in those kind of conditions. And unfortunately, because of issues, climate change is causing heavier wind conditions, it's changing weather patterns, it's making things hotter and drier, so you have a much more receptive fuel bed. Keep in mind the fact that this was November 8th, 2018, November 8th, very late in the year to see these kind of conditions. And so this is the kind of, these are the kind of conditions that are now taking place. This is a news video, and I want you to pay attention to the embers. You've talked about, I think Nick was talking about the embers and things. This is a news video that you'll see, and pay attention to the embers.
But the winds have kind of been picking up in the last few minutes or so, and that's what crews here are worried about. They've been cutting down trees in this area, hoping it doesn't spread into downtown. Now that's some of that video that we shot earlier. That's taken actually of Via de Santa Fe and Via de la Valle, where at least 3 homes were on fire. Now, these burning embers just filled the sky. It looked like a rainstorm of fire and ash. And firefighters say the big problem in that area are the palm trees because, you know, they go up very quickly. The embers spread to other areas, and they say that's how this particular fire started.
So there we have it again, in case you needed another example of how come embers are our big problem. And we're going to be talking a lot about embers during this session. So those are some videos, and I hope many of you have not had the luxury of seeing that, but maybe some of you have and have been in firestorms where you saw that ember storm just blowing. So now we go back through and start talking about what the results of this are. This is a fire map of the campfire. So the red outline that you see going around the perimeter was the actual perimeter of the campfire in 2018. The actual ignition point, you can barely see it in this slide, but up on the Feather River, I don't know, my pointer isn't very good, but right around here, right there is where the ignition point was. There was as it all came out, there was a large transmission power line that was going through the canyon on the Feather River, and one of the power lines, because of those winds that you saw in that previous video, one of the power lines dropped onto the grass, and the winds took off and pointed it all, you know, coming from the northeast down to the southwest. So that was the direction that the fire took place. All those dots, all those red dots, almost 20,000 of them, are the points of all the structures that were destroyed. In the town of Paradise, Concow, and moving down here, Chico is just off to the left over here, and this is Highway 99, where they finally it was getting down into the flatlands. The winds were starting to die down a little bit at that point, and they were actually able to use Highway 99 as kind of the stopping point of finally getting that fire under control. But this is a map showing you of all the destruction. 10,696 residential structures. It was over 90% of the entire housing stock in the town of Paradise was completely destroyed. We look at situations like this. This is an actual view of a neighborhood in the Thomas Fire. And the anomaly about this, and the thing that everybody is studying right now, is that why do we have this hopscotch? This is a really good photo to show the fact that lots of homes still existed in the fire footprint, but we have individual homes. This pointer doesn't work very well, but you see these homes that are here that are surviving right amongst all the neighbors that were burned down. So why do some homes survive and others don't? It might be just the simple answer that there is an engine parked in the driveway. But the problem is, and as probably Nick shared with you, if you want firefighters to feel comfortable coming to your home to protect it, that's great. But the sad truth is that there are never, ever, ever going to be enough fire engines to park in everybody's driveway. That's never going to happen. So you have to be able to think about your house surviving on its own, okay, without a fire engine being there. And we know how to do that today, and we're going to get into that some more. This is another video from IBHS. IBHS is the Insurance Institute for Business and Home Safety. Essentially, they're a nonprofit industry that is funded by the insurance industry. Hundreds of insurance companies fund them to do testing. They have a very large laboratory back in South Carolina, and they can build full-scale homes like this and turn on the wall of fans that they have and mimic a Category 3 hurricane. Or they have a machine that actually builds ice balls, and they pound them at roof panels to test hail damage on roofing materials and things like this. They also have this machine that is affectionately known as the Dragon, that they can burn embers and throw with those and just mimic a large firestorm. And so this is a video at the IBHS testing lab showing what they are building these homes, and then they basically start lighting them on fire and sit back and watch. And that's how we're learning a lot about what these embers are doing to homes. So watch this video, if I can make it work. I don't know why it's not working. Why is it not working? Huh, it's frozen. It's a really cool video. Oh, different PowerPoint. What will end up happening is you're going to see the embers blowing just like you did in that news video. Oh, there it is, if you can find the picture now. There we go. Okay, it's working on the computer. Everybody come up and look at the computer. I have no idea why it's not translated. We had no problems with this yesterday, so I don't know what's going on. There we go. You may have to stand. Okay. This is extremely realistic. For those of us who have spent a career going to fires, seeing embers bombard homes like that is extremely realistic. That's exactly what they do. And you can see that they had built this with pine needles and things that were in the gutters, and you can see how quickly. This is literally a matter of only a few minutes after they started throwing the embers at it. The asphalt shingles are Class A, which are resisting the ignition, but the windows and things are going to start to burn. They've got bark mulch around this house. You can see some vegetation, and the pine needles and everything up on the roof are all burning. So These are a lot of the studies that are going on back at IBHS and other locations around the world that we're just sitting back and watching the embers bombard this house in a very realistic manner and learning about what can work and changing the materials and changing things about the house and the landscaping around it that will allow us to be better at telling you what you can and should and shouldn't do to allow these fires to not ignite the house. The point is, we need structures to be able to withstand that bombardment of embers without ever igniting. And that can be done. We've seen examples of it, and we're going to tell you what you can do. Okay, now it's just going to keep going. All right, so one of the things that CAL FIRE has done is that we have put together a program called the DINS program. That stands for Damage Inspection. And it was a program that we created back in 2014 to start gathering data electronically for every structure that is damaged or destroyed by wildfires today. We now collect information. This goes up to 2021. We don't have the 2022 stats in this particular slide, but you can see the total number right here that exists in this database up to the end of 2021 is over 56,000 structures. And that's only been since 2014. This is just in California. I don't know of any other states. We're passing this out to other states. Other states are looking at doing it. But let's face it, California has the largest structure loss problem from wildfires of any other state in the country. And so when we look at these numbers, we look at the way that we go out and gather information is in 4 categories. It's either affected, which means that there is less than a 10% damage to the house. Between 10% and 25% is considered to be a minor damage. Between 25 and 50% is considered to be a major damage to the structure. And anything over 50% is considered to be completely destroyed. These are based on guidelines that FEMA has used for years in establishing damage assessment for flooding and hurricanes and things like this. So we adopted that same category for affected, minor, major, and destroyed. And if you look at the numbers, you can see that around 92% of every structure that we do assessments on is completely destroyed. That means that if you're in a wildfire situation and your house ignites, it's got less than an 8% chance of surviving. It'll probably most likely burn down. When we look at these in a different way, we look at the different numbers of structures destroyed by year. And of course, you see the 2017 was when the large fires occurred up in the wine country, and Tubbs Fire, Atlas Fire, Nuns Fire, all those things in Napa and Sonoma counties. 2018, of course, was the Camp Fire, the Carr Fire, those kind of things. And then, of course, 2020 again was the lightning sieges that were occurring around the state and all these kind of things. So you can see this dramatic increase in structure losses that we are seeing today. When we look at the other statistics, CAL FIRE keeps 3 top 20 lists. These are all available on CAL FIRE's website. They update them fairly frequently. The top 20 lists include the 20 largest fires in California history, the 20 most destructive fires in California history, and the 20 deadliest fires, where the most fatalities occurred. I don't show that deadliest one, but it is obviously the Camp Fire with 85 fatalities is the highest fatality fire that has ever occurred in the state. And we look at these, on the top 20 largest, if you look through just 2020 and 2021 alone, in a 2-year period, we had almost 60% of the largest fires that have ever occurred in the state occurred in just 2 years. Almost 75–80% have occurred since 2010. So you can see this dramatic growth of fires getting much larger, much more destructive. You can see again, the number of structures lost have been growing exponentially. So these are statistics that we simply don't have the luxury of ignoring. And you can't simply say, well, things will get better on their own, because they're not. people ask me about the campfire, and my response is something like, the campfire is just simply the worst one we've seen so far. And that's a very, very sad thing for me to say, because I feel extremely not comfortable, that's the wrong word. I feel very confident that, unfortunately, I fear that we'll see other fires that will be much worse than the campfire. And that's almost a given. When you look at the trajectory of our paths of the most destructive and the largest fires, it's almost a given that this is going to continue to get worse. Because if you think that the campfire was the peak, and that's the worst we'll ever see, then that means everything's getting better from here on out. And it's not. That's the reality of what we're doing. So we have to accept the fact that it's entirely likely that we'll see even worse. These are just a very quick summary, going back all the way to the 1800s, of various bills, both federal and state, that have been trying to keep up with fuel acts and firefighting. The 1951 to 80 had the National Historic Preservation Act, the Clean Air Act, the National Environmental Protection Act, California's CEQA, California Environmental Quality, all these kind of things. And so all of these things have been being put in place to try to help curb the impacts of wildfires when they occur. But the factors that are playing into this are the things that we all know about. I mean, certainly climate change is a big one, probably the most major one. And there's a lot of fingers that go off climate change. But I can guarantee you that since I started being a firefighter in 1986, when I it was my first year as a seasonal firefighter with CAL FIRE, I have seen the number of days that we call fire season, which today we don't even refer to fire season as a thing any longer. It's fire year. We get fires burning 12 months out of the year. Now, fortunately, this year we got a lot of rain. And so our ignitions here during the winter have gone down significantly, and that's a good thing. But on a typical given year, there are numerous fires that are occurring every month, 12 months out of the year. So it's no longer just a fire season, it's a fire year. But the drought, the tree mortality that has come from the bug diseases and the pine beetle diseases and all these kind of things have caused a massive amount of dead trees. When the drought went through and the bark beetle destroyed the ponderosa pine forest back in probably from 2014 through 2016 and 17, there was approximately 165 million trees that were killed in the forest. Well, those are all just standing dead timber now, that when a fire burns through those areas today, it burns much hotter, much faster, because it's got a lot of dead fuel to burn. So the tree mortality is a problem, which increases the accumulation of the fuel load in the forest. There is continuing development in California. I mean, we all know that there's a housing crisis across the country too, right? And in California, as land becomes more and more developed, it's pushing more into those wildfire-prone areas. So we need to learn to do better, to build smarter with better materials that can resist these fires when they hit. And severe weather events. I mean, going back to climate change again. So all of these factors are, considerations. Again, the statistics are very, very clear. Just in the last 40, 50 years, we've seen an exponential growth in the number of days that are likely for fires to occur. And so these days continue to grow and grow. The number of acres burned, again, this is just another bar graph that shows you again the exponential explosive growth of the size of fires. And it's not only the explosive growth, but in 2020, when we had the Dixie Fire and the Caldor Fire that burned, that forced the evacuation of South Lake Tahoe and all those kind of things, those were two anomalies that I'll share with you that had never occurred before in recorded history. In the fire world, we refer to the Sierra Mountain Range as the big granite wall. We've never had a fire that has jumped over the top of the Sierra Nevadas. They burn on the west side, the winds are blowing them, they crawl up into the area where there's no trees and no vegetation and no brush, and they go out because the granite doesn't burn. Right? We've never had a fire that went over the top of the mountains until 2020. Was it 2020 or 2021 when the Dixie and, I get all of them messed up. Was it 21? Caldor fire and the Dixie fire. The Dixie, they were almost back to back. The Dixie fire started first. It was way up north. It went to almost 1 million acres. Just one fire, just shy of 1 million acres. The Caldor fire started about a month after the Dixie fire, and both of those fires jumped the top of the granite wall and continued to burn down. The Dixie fire almost into Nevada, and the Caldor fire burned right down to South Shore Lake Tahoe, and that was why Tahoe had to be completely evacuated. And those events, a fire burning up and jumping over the top of the Sierra Nevadas, had never occurred before. And we had 2 of them happen within a month of each other. That is raising a lot of eyebrows. And people who were up there, I've talked to people who were fighting those fires up there, and they literally said it looked like the rocks themselves were burning. Because if you've ever hiked up in the high Sierras up above the tree lines and things, there's still grasses and vegetation and things like that that are still growing in amongst the crevices of the rocks, right? Well, the winds, the embers, and all of these things continued to go ahead and burn, and it carried the fire all the way up over the top of those mountains and continued burning to the east. So these are events that we don't see, that we've never seen happen before, but now we're seeing them happen. When we talk about the WUI, the wildland-urban interface, or the wildland-urban intermix, it's just the fact that where we're building. So when we talk about an interface, it means that the buildings and subdivisions are built right up to a line with the vegetation right across the road, or your back fence, okay? Whereas if you get an intermix, it means that the vegetation and the land use planning, usually larger lots, but it's interspersed with lots of vegetation scattered all amongst it. And we have examples of both of those everywhere, all over the state of California, all over the western United States. And so those are the intermix areas that we're looking at. In California, over 1 million acres, 67% of interface housing is in the higher, very high fire hazard severity zones. 83% of the state's 2.2 million housing units are in a dense interface area, highly susceptible to wildfire impacts. And so as we continue to build, we need to be smarter about where we do it, how we build, what materials we build, and things like that. I'm not going to stand here and say, if it's dangerous, we shouldn't build. I don't believe in that. I am an architect by original trade, and I think that it is completely, with all the science that we have and stuff now, it is completely possible to build smartly with good materials that are highly resistive to fire ignition. And if we use those principles, we have a much, much better chance of surviving fires when they occur. And that's what we should be doing, not just writing everything off and saying, oh, it's too dangerous, don't build here. My opinion is that, yes, it is dangerous. Let's recognize the risk, identify what the challenges are, and build smarter than we ever have before to address those problems. And we can do that. And that's what we have to try to do. So again, just some of the statistics. We've got interface and intermix. 73% of the intermix houses are in higher, very high fire hazard severity zones and things like this. And again, this is the bar graph of the structure losses. When we go back here to 2003, do you all remember the big wildfire siege in Southern California in 2003? That was when the Cedar Fire burned. The Cedar Fire at the time was the largest fire that had ever occurred in California. It only lasted for 14 years until the Thomas Fire burned. And the Thomas Fire was the largest fire for only 9 months before the Mendocino complex burned. So the frequency of these large fires gets more and more. In 2007, we had another Southern California siege. And then, of course, we see the fires in 2015, the Valley Fire in Lake County, the Butte Fire in Calaveras County, and then of course 17, 18, 20, and things like that. So these fires, the structure loss just continues to grow. So now we're going to go through and start talking about some of this stuff you've already seen, and I'm not going to labor on it. Of course, Fire triangle, oxygen, heat, and fuel. You have to have all of those for fire to burn. Okay? We have a similar fuel triangle for wildfires. So the wildfire pieces go together in another triangle that we refer to as topography, weather, and fuel. All right? The interesting part about those three items is that the topography is largely set. I mean, the mountains, the valleys, everything, we're not going to change that largely. I mean, those topographic features are what they are, and that's where they are. We're also not going to really influence the weather very much. I mean, we all want to make the weather better and make climate change better and things like that, but that's not going to happen very soon, and we don't really have a lot of individual control over that, certainly not on a day-to-day basis. But the one thing we do have control over are the fuels. We get to choose what we build, where we build it, with what materials, how we landscape with what materials, and all of those decisions are decisions that we make. We have the luxury of making sure that we can change the fuels whenever and however we like to do it. And so that is the component that we have to focus on. We can't change the topography or weather, but we are going to change fuel loading, and that's what this will do. You've already seen the primary impacts of fire are because of radiant heat or direct flame contact, but by and large, the biggest ignition factor for structures in wildlands today are the embers. And that says that more than 60% of home ignitions, it's assumed that we're probably in most fires today, over 90% of every structure that ignites is because of the embers, either directly or indirectly, but it's because of the embers. It's not direct flame contact and it's not radiant heat. However, when you do get into situations like the Coffee Park neighborhood in Santa Rosa or Paradise, where you had multiple mobile home parks and things like that, when the structures are placed very closely together and there's very little separation distance between them, the radiant heat and direct flame contact start to become a bigger issue. But by and large, in structures, wildfires today, roughly 90% or even more are directly because of embers. Now, I'd make an argument that I could say, pick any topic you want. It doesn't matter what it is, but if you pick a topic and there's a problem with it and you identify the fact that 90% of the problem with that topic is this one thing, I would argue that that's probably the one thing you should really begin focusing on and trying to figure out how to fix that. I don't care what the topic is. In a wildfire, if we know that embers are the cause of about 90% of the home ignitions, then we really need to focus on that. And that's what we're here to do today. Very quickly, going through the responsibility areas. In California, every speck of land on the state is divided up into three areas. Either federal responsibility area, which in this map is the green areas. That's all our national parks, all our the national forests, Bureau of Land Management areas, things like that. That's roughly about half the state. And out of that roughly 50% of the state, the Forest Service and the federal government have control over about 66%, just shy of 70% of all the forested landscapes in the state are under the control of the federal government. The state responsibility area is the unincorporated areas that have watershed value. So when we look at the SRA, about 31% of the state, or a little over 100, if there's roughly about 101 million acres in the state, about 31% of it is state responsibility area, and the remainder of it are all the incorporated cities and the big areas in the Central Valley and such that are not watershed quality areas. They don't have any value of watershed because they're flat farming areas. And so you can see here that every piece of the state is divided up into federal, state, or local responsibility areas. And that determines who has the jurisdictional authority. SRA by state law is that CAL FIRE has the responsibility both legally and financially to suppress and reduce the risk of wildfire ignitions. When we look at the state responsibility areas. I'm not going to get into all the public resource code requirements, but they're updated roughly once every 5 years. They go through a complete change, and anytime a city incorporates additional land, that changes from SRA to LRA and things like that because the city has chosen to incorporate that landscape. Are we taking a break? Okay, before we get into the hazard severity zones, which I am sure that some of you are interested in, and we do that, I think we're going to have a lunch break. Is that correct? Okay, I'll turn it over to Anne Marie here, and we'll come back after lunch to talk about that.
So we're going to take a 30-minute lunch break. So come back around 12:45. We have lunch out there. I can't remember if they marked gluten bread or not, so if you're gluten intolerant or gluten-free, sorry. But feel free to also mill around if you have free time after lunch. You can eat in here, eat outside, look at the home portal. We have our exhibit set up right behind to the right, and bathrooms. And if anyone, again, online has any questions, I can put up our email again, so email us and we'll get back to you later next week. All right, thanks everyone.
How do I get back to the PowerPoint? Okay, everybody have a good lunch? Very good. I think we're ready to get started again. So as people start filtering back in, where we left off, I am going to pick up on the fire hazard severity zones. I see somebody published the Gmail account for questions to come in, and why. Hey, Kevin, I need your help again. It's not forwarding. It's working perfectly on the laptop up here, so maybe you all have to come up here and stare at the laptop. Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, I'm not sure what happened here, but it somehow got disconnected. But I think if we just click it here, then it'll, you click it.
Oh, is this on? Yep, it's on. Okay. Yep, here we go. Okay, good. So the fire hazard severity zones are identifying the hazard, and I want to spend just a moment defining and making sure you understand the difference between hazard and risk. A lot of those terms get used interchangeably, but they are two very different things. Hazard is the likelihood that a fire might occur based on what the natural conditions are. So for example, if you've got a forested area and it is looked at over a very long period of time, in over, say, 50 years, that forest has a likelihood of a fire occurring, and based on what the density of the fuel is, the type of fuel, things like that, it is categorized in one of three categories. It's either moderate, high, or very high. Now, fire hazard maps started back in the 1980s, but the trigger that really grew the fire hazard severity zones was the 1991 tunnel fire in the Oakland Hills. When that fire burned, and I think if we look at this, because I'm going to go to the next slide, I think I've got some information on this. If we look at this slide, these are the fire hazard severity zones as listed in the state responsibility only. You'll notice that the big sections of white are local responsibility, the San Joaquin Valley, and of course the Sierra Nevadas, which have a lot of our national parks and national forests and things like that. The fire hazard severity zone is not mapped on federal lands at all. After 1991, this is kind of diving into the fire hazard severity zone. I picked out Butte County. If you go onto the website for the State Fire Marshal's Office, you can pull up all the maps for the entire state, county by county, and look at individual maps to see where the fire hazard severity zones are. If you look at this map, this is the state responsibility area maps, and you can see the yellow is moderate, the orange is high, and the red is very high. Now, these are the old maps that date back to 2007. They have just recently, are all of you familiar with the fact that they've just been updated? And there are new maps that have just been presented across the state. The legislature required CAL FIRE to go around and do one presentation in every county, which they have done, and they are now reading through all the public comments. So it's in the public comment period at the moment. And as soon as they get done making any adjustments based on those comments, then the new maps, which will have a 2022 date on them, will be published for the state responsibility area. The next phase is going to be publishing the fire hazard severity zone maps in the local jurisdictions, in the local responsibility areas. And so when we look at this map of Butte County, for example, you can see that big area right there in the middle that's gray. That's Paradise. That's the incorporated city limits of the town of Paradise right there in the middle of it. And if we go back, let's see, where was it? I think it's later on in the presentation. But when we look at the local jurisdiction in Paradise, we're going to see that almost the entire city is red or very high. In the 2007 maps, they finally went ahead and published the local responsibility area maps, but they only identified the very high zones in local responsibility areas. The new maps that will be coming out later this year for the new evaluations in local responsibility area will likely show both the high and the very high zones in local jurisdictions. They're even talking about maybe publishing the whole thing and identifying the moderate zones also, but that hasn't been determined yet by the Board of Forestry. So they're still talking about that. What those maps tie into are building codes, for example. In the state responsibility area, you have to use Chapter 7A, which is the chapter in the California Building Code that is known as the WUI Code, the Wildland Urban Interface Code, that you're required to build to when you build in the state responsibility area. But in local jurisdictions, unless the city has dictated that you can use that code any place, they're still required to employ that code in the very high zones in the cities. Now, the new maps that have just come out for the state show about a 14 or 15% increase in the amount of acreage of very high fire hazard severity zones. So naturally, I think it goes without saying, we've been witnessing all these fires getting worse and worse, and so clearly the new research that has been done to create these new maps identify the fact that there are more acres that are high and very high fire hazard severity zones. So the new maps reflect that. I have not seen the local government maps yet, but it is a very strong suspicion of mine that just as the acreage has increased in state responsibility, we will most likely see an increase in acreage of very high in local jurisdictions also. That's just my guess, but we'll have to wait until they come out and see them. In 1991, when the Oakland Hills burned, there was a big question about, where could a similar fire like this occur? The tunnel fire, as it was known back then, was actually a fairly small fire. It was only 1,600 acres, which, as we all know, that's not a huge fire. 1,600 acres, but there was over 4,000 structures in the way. And at the time, that fire became the deadliest and the most destructive fire in California history, and it wasn't eclipsed until the Tubbs fire burned in 2017 and destroyed more homes in the Tubbs fire than had been in the Oakland Hills fire back in 1991. But the director and the legislature directed CAL FIRE to go ahead and redo all the maps back then based on the Bates bill to find out where all these hazards existed and where fires might burn. Here's my map of Paradise. So this is the local government view of Paradise. The people who lived in Paradise knew this very clearly. They were very well aware of the fact that they lived in a high fire hazard area. It wasn't news to them. The fact that a bad fire burned through Paradise, quite frankly, didn't shock many of us. We sort of knew that it was a complete possibility that something like that could happen. What really struck us was the fact of how fast it burned. The city of Paradise had been so concerned about it that about 10 years before the fire, they had actually created some very, very good evacuation plans, but it was designed to be phased in. There was like zone 1, zone 2, zone 3, and so on, to go ahead and phase evacuations of people to get them out in time. No one, the morning of that fire when it happened, had predicted that all those zones would all have to go all at once right now. It just had never been an occurrence, and they hadn't practiced it that way. The city actually had taken time to actually practice their evacuation plan in person as early as June and July, just before the fire burned in November. And it's most of our opinions that had they not had that plan, which was a very good evacuation plan, had they not had that plan and not practiced it, as bad as that fire was, it most likely could have been even much worse. So those evacuation plans did do a lot of good because people were aware and had practiced what to do in the event of an emergency like this. Let's see, again, we don't do any of the FRA things and stuff like that. The severity zones, I'm not going to get too deep into this, but the last, the iterations before the 2003 and 2007 sieges in San Diego had a lot of moderate fire hazard. But after those fires, a lot of it became red because they recognized it's like, you know what, the hazard is much worse than what we thought there. And so the maps were updated to reflect the higher hazard there. Now I was going to make sure that, this is the new maps are going to be, this is the kind of the severity zone and the guidelines for what's going on now, the new maps coming out. The difference between, as I started to say, between hazard and risk, the risk is what you do to your property. If you go out and clear brush, or you put a newer, better roof on, or you replace siding or windows or decks or whatever you do, that's changing the risk, not the hazard. The hazard still is there, despite everything that you're doing to reduce the risk, but the risk is something that changes on a daily basis. If you go out and mow your yard or clear vegetation or something like that, that alters the risk. But guess what? That stuff all grows back again, right? So you have to keep doing it. The hazard doesn't really change much over a long period of time. It stays pretty much constant. So that's the big difference between what hazard is and what risk is. So anyway, they're doing all these presentations. The maps are going to be published here fairly soon, I'm told. And then later this year, the LRA maps will come out, and we'll see what those look like when they do. Yes, the local jurisdictions will, those maps will be published later in the year. All right, now yesterday this wouldn't play, but I'm going to try to get it to play. This is some videos that are by Jack Cohen. Jack Cohen is a retired research scientist from the U.S. Forest Service. He was one of the earliest voices that started talking about this ember problem and recognizing the fact that it wasn't the big forest fires and flames that were affecting homes. It was something different. And he was the one who really kind of focused in on this ember problem and is one of the earliest people that a lot of the research that's being done around the world followed what Jack Cohen was saying, and he's still living today. Excuse me. He's a wonderful person to talk to, very smart, and I'm going to see if I can play this video here.
When I show this picture to people, they're absolutely amazed that this can occur. First of all, we have the sense that wildfire high-intensity wildfire, like depicted in this particular picture, absolutely engulfs and explodes houses into flames. When I show this picture to people, they're absolutely amazed that this can occur. First of all, we have the sense that high-intensity wildfire, like depicted in this particular picture, absolutely engulfs and explodes houses into flames. And so when I show this, and by the way, let me just say that this high-intensity fire at its closest point is about 45 feet from this house. And let me also say that the photographer in this picture was feeling a considerable exposure to the flame. They were beginning to feel the pain that is accompanied by the exposure that produces injury. But that says nothing about what's going on with this house. So let's take a look and see what the house looks like after the fire. So the crown fire has spread through and the house is still here. And the house is still there not because fire suppression, fire protection actions were taken to keep that house from burning down. This house actually did not ignite from that fire. So where's the disconnect in all of this? Well, the disconnect is between what we feel as a person and what it takes to ignite this structure from flames. What we feel is pain and injury from exposures to heat that is considerably less than what it takes to actually even char wood. Let me give you an example. The exposure that will produce a second-degree burn on my exposed skin in 5 seconds takes over 27 minutes to ignite the wood. What that means is that I can get very burned from a fire and the house isn't even beginning to char. So what does that mean in terms of our perspective? Well, what that means is that we start paying attention to these big flames, which then produces our perception that, my goodness, how in the world can this house still be here with all that flame in the picture? And the reason is because the requirements for combustion that are produced by a flame like that are so much higher than what it takes to cause us injury that our perspective is personal. Our perspective is from our pain and injury, not from the requirements for combustion. So as it turns out, we are many, many times, more than 100 times more sensitive to pain and injury than what it takes to actually ignite this house. And that means we start paying a lot of attention to flames like this and not to things like firebrands. Firebrands that are extremely effective in igniting the structure from their accumulation and then slowly producing glowing combustion on the house that then produces flaming combustion if it sustains and eventually destroys the house, is out of our perspective. Our perspective is on what affects us, the big flames, the big heat that we feel that produces the pain that impresses us is not necessarily related to what it takes to ignite the structure.
So that's a lot of information very quickly, and it points out the fact that we as human beings are very susceptible to our perspective and what we think about fire and the impacts of fire on our structures in a way that is not meaningful. As he just explained, the amount of heat and energy that it takes to ignite that structure is far, far more than what we experience from flame and heat. But it clouds our perspective because now we start thinking about what we should be doing. And if we use his studies, and there's another picture, I'm not going to go through this one because it's where he is talking about the ember issues and all those kind of things. The same thing that he was just kind of talking about in that photograph. But it's amazing when he shows a wood structure 45 feet from walls of flame that never even ignited because there wasn't anything around the structure that had the components that would produce an ignition. It had good vegetation clearance right around it, even though it was sitting in the middle of a vast forest that was burning. So the forest burned, but it never reached its ignition components.
Interestingly, when we...
I'm going to go ahead and go through this. Jack has some really great sayings that everybody in the fire service is using today. That second one, uncontrolled extreme wildfires are inevitable. They've been a part of the landscape for many, many years. It does not mean that wildland-urban interface disasters are inevitable as well. We have great opportunities as homeowners to prevent our houses from igniting during those wildfires. And this other one, the wildland-urban fire is a structure ignition problem, not a problem of controlling those inevitable wildfires. So we have to think of it like that. The fire isn't the problem. It's the fact that we haven't taken the steps to remove the ignition components of our structures. That's what we have to focus on. And I love this bottom one. Fire does not behave capriciously. It either meets the requirements for combustion or it doesn't. It's that simple. If you remove the components that allow for combustion to occur, then it's not going to ignite. And that's what you have to keep focusing on. It's not the wildfire problem. It's a home ignition problem. This goes into some information from the National Institute for Standards and Technology about how if you get urban fires going into larger cities, you get large wildland fires here to the right. They get into part of the cities and become urban conflagrations because of the surrounding buildings and the closeness to them and things like that. But again, if we start looking at removing the ignition capacity of structures, then fires can continue to burn normally like they have always done, and they won't ignite the structures. So that's our goal. When we look at these wildfire exposures too, we're all talking about what can I do for my house? But you don't live in an isolated bubble, most of you probably. If you are lucky enough to live on a very, very large property without any kind of exposure or anything from any of your neighbors, then you get the luxury of going ahead and choosing just what you want to do on your structure and the surrounding property. But most of us live in areas where you have neighbors that are somewhat close together. And it's not just what you do. If you, as an individual, do everything perfectly, but your neighbor doesn't, the risk to your home has not necessarily been eliminated. And it's not an equal equation. If you do, all right, I've done 80% of what I'm supposed to do, then my risk has just been reduced by 80%. Not necessarily, because that final 20% that you didn't do, that now has a very high risk that that's the spot where the embers could go ahead and ignite your house. So it's kind of a package deal, folks. You don't have the luxury of thinking about doing one thing that you think will be the solution and ignoring everything else, because it is the entire package. You don't get to just harden your home and not address the vegetation and landscaping around it. You don't get the luxury of just addressing the vegetation, but doing nothing to your house. You have to do both. And that's the important part of learning about how it all goes together. Now, a lot of this is where we're going to get into the science. How do we know these things? And this is one of the takeaways that I'm going to ask you to go back to your houses and look at very carefully. Fires will carry through, I'm going to say this, fire's really lazy. It really is. It wants to always take the path of least resistance. That's why it follows topography as well as it does, because it's just swirling through the landscape. It's not going to try to take the really hard way of going through the landscape. It's going to follow the easiest path that it can find. It's also going to do the exact same thing around your property. If you've got wooden fences that are going up and touching your house, and I'm going to talk about fences a lot here, folks, wooden fences are a major cause of home ignitions today. Wooden fences, bark mulch, those kind of things are the really primary issues why many, many homes are being destroyed today. In this particular picture, and this is a photo from a real house that was burned in Paradise, one of the emergency responders took this photo, and NIST, the National Institute for Standards and Technology, used it as one of their test examples, where the radiant heat from the burning fence ignited the brush that was down below that then turned into the ladder fuels that went right up into the tree. And because the tree had never been trimmed and had limbs that were actually even underneath the eave line, the house ignited, because that path of the fire just followed from piece to piece to piece, and eventually the house was right there and it caught on fire. No efforts had been taken to break that path and remove the chain for the fire to not ever reach the house, and that house didn't survive. These are all the things that NIST is looking at. In the middle there, the residents, they're looking at eaves, roof, vents, siding, windows and doors, garage doors, all these things that are the recognized causes of why homes are igniting. But they're also looking at everything else. They're looking at the wildland vegetation around it, other residences, vehicles, attached combustibles, sheds, barns, all these kind of things. So all of these are being looked at as the causes of combustion. That's the NIST and other examples of research groups in Australia, the Pau Costa Foundation in Europe. All of these groups are working together to try to find answers to all of these things. And what they're finding out, again, this is a real example, again from Paradise, that NIST studied to show you various ignition points. In this particular example, you have ignition A, B, C, and D. In these examples, they show where the path of the fire went to destroy homes, okay? So this path actually went along a bark mulch bed with a fence, attached to the house, destroyed this house, and then the radiant heat destroyed the house next door to it, and these kind of things. So you can follow the path of where all these fires went, and the fire on that one residence number 2 actually started burning, but the firefighters were there and removed the fence. You can see the blue circle there. That's where the fence had been attached to the house, but the firefighters removed the fence, broke the path, and the house survived. So those are the things that we want to keep looking at. This is a video. That's actually Coffey Park up there in Santa Rosa right after the fire. But these are the structures these are the tests that are being done to show what the likelihood of ignition from surrounding buildings or sheds are. So for example, they've built a mock house, and then they've got a shed, and they're doing all these different tests here. SSD stands for structure separation distance. So they're doing lots of tests, like moving these structures back and forth and building more of them, lighting them on fire, and seeing what that structure separation distance should be to go ahead and maximize with what materials they're using on the outside that would help reduce the combustion of structures that are nearby each other. So these are some of the tests that are going on. Again, fences. Again, a major cause of where the fence meets the houses. They've done lots of tests with bark mulch, pine needles, different types of vegetation on these test beds near and against. You can see how the fire has been burning this bark mulch. It gets up to adjacent to this house, and you can see how it can easily start igniting that house if that flammable material hasn't been removed. So these are just some of the tests that are ongoing that we're learning. Again, they'll light these things, and they're doing lots of photos and heat sensors and all kinds of things to try to determine what can be done, or what will be the ideal solutions to go ahead and prevent these fires from ever reaching the building. Think of it again as the path that the fire is going to take to ignite that structure, and that's what you want to learn. I hope none of you have your wood piles for your, if you have a wood burning stove or something right against your house. I don't want to see a show of hands, but go home and move it, okay? Needs to be very far away from your house. I know it's a little inconvenient to walk out and have to lug it back in, but that's important to make sure that things like that are highly combustible are not sitting right adjacent and right against your house. Fences again. The hazard mitigation summary, the 3 R's. You can either remove it, you can reduce the amount of vegetation and flammable materials, or you can relocate things. Yes, sir? Yeah, they burn really well. Plastic sheds melt. So when they melt, the issue with plastic sheds are that they let off a lot of heat. They're very, very hot when they do burn. And then, of course, depending on what you have inside it. So plastic sheds are not a solution. They'll still burn, and they still produce a lot of heat that can easily ignite things adjacent to it, whether it's a fence or a carport or your house or anything else. So they definitely have ignition components. Yeah, go ahead. They are still, I don't have an answer for that, and that's exactly what these tests are doing. They're using different types of sheds, whether it's metal, wood, plastic. They're doing all kinds of tests with them right now. And they will be publishing some reports in the next few years that will give us better information on that. But I honestly don't have that information right available to me yet. Don't we? Yes. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, anything it's all those things are going to be combustible. So again, where you place them, adjacent to structures, fences, things like that, you're choosing where to put it and whether it creates a path to get to the house or not. And yes?
A quick comment. Some people online asked for questions. Maybe you can just repeat it, just so that people who are live streaming in.
Understood. The questions that we are discussing right now is the viability of different types of sheds, whether they be plastic, metal, wood, whatever the type of material is. And the research is ongoing right now to determine how far away they should be and which material is going to be the best material to reduce flame path and travel to adjacent structures. So I don't have an answer for it yet. Those are tests that are ongoing, and we'll find that soon. One more question here. So the question is about artificial turf. So artificial turf burns really well too. It actually doesn't support combustion so much as it melts because it's plastic. And so it does melt and it off-gasses a lot of bad stuff. And so it can become a big hazard because as it melts, it lets off a lot of heat again. And so it's, once again, if you're going to use artificial turf, don't put it against your house. Think of it as bark mulch and just remove it so that there's a separation between it. Okay? All right, keep going. This is, again, I'm not going to go through this whole thing, but this is, I'll start it. This is, again, at the laboratory in South Carolina for IBHS. This is Dan Gorham, who I've done a lot of work with. And they built a duplex, basically. On the right-hand side of this duplex, it's got all the right materials. Fire-resistant materials, metal gutters, good screens, all these kind of things that they did to reduce the risk of ignition. On the left side, of course, you can see what they did. It's a wood house with wood siding, bark mulch, all these kind of things. And then they turned the Dragon on, and this is...
From start to finish, we're going to start with our ember generators, which we use to recreate a realistic ember exposure. Embers are those small burning and smoldering particles that may travel ahead of the fire front. And what we do with our generators is we create the realistic exposure, and in our wind tunnel, we're able to throw them at a building. And then we have a building that has two sides to it, a good side, which uses wildfire resistant construction, and what we're considering a typical building that we would see in a wildfire prone area.
So you can see what's happening right there.
Exactly as we expected, that mulch on the ground there caught fire from the embers. The fire from the mulch burned up under this deck, and this whole deck was on fire. And so this fire on this deck caused flames right against the home. And then if we look there at the base of the door, it was actually the flames from this deck that burned through the bottom of the door, and on the inside of the house we started to see smoke and flames. And so because this deck was a combustible material attached to the building, when the embers led to the ignition of this deck, we got flames inside of the building. Here we are on the wildfire resistant side of the house, where we had non-combustible siding, a 5-foot non-combustible zone and 6-inch gap. We had a metal gutter and multi-pane windows, and we see in comparison to the non-wildfire resistant side, this side had the same ember exposure. If you look here in the mulch, you can actually see some of the embers that had accumulated, but because they had no susceptible fuel to ignite, they just landed there and fizzled out. Now here where we have ornamental vegetation, that again is susceptible to the embers, but because it's more than 5 feet away from the home, it didn't have enough energy to ignite, and it never led to a flame impact on the building.
So Yes, sir.
The two decks look really similar. There was something about some foil tape. Is that the only difference, and where did they put it?
There were two differences. Yes. So the question from the gentleman in the audience was about the decks on those homes. And from a visual standpoint, they're virtually identical to one another. They both had wood framing material and such, but the differences are this. What we have begun to understand is that if you're building a brand new deck today out of wood products, on your joist, before you put the deck boards on, if you were to just take some kind of a metal or foil tape of some sort and wrap the top of the joist, that has been proven to show, I'll get to a picture of it here soon, that has proven to be eliminating the path of the fire from burning up onto the deck boards, because now you've got a non-combustible joint between the joist and the deck boards, and it starts helping to reduce the likelihood that the deck will burn. So that's what that foil tape means if you have the luxury of building brand new, or if you're going to replace deck boards. That's the recommendation today, is to go ahead and put a separation joint between the joists and the deck boards. The other difference between that is in the house that burned, you noticed the deck was sitting on top of bark mulch. In the good side of the house, it was sitting on top of gravel. So naturally, the gravel didn't ignite, and the deck didn't have any exposure to ignitable properties. How many of you have ever built a campfire? So, how do you do that? You start off with like grass and then very small little twigs and things like this, and then you get bigger pieces of wood and things like that, and you light it all on fire and it just starts burning, and eventually the big pieces of wood start burning and you roast your marshmallows, right? Look at what that deck was. They had the small little combustible materials on the bottom and the bigger pieces of wood on top of it for the deck. Essentially, they were building a campfire. Okay? So think about that. I mean, that's exactly what you do when you're building a campfire. So if you go back to your homes and look, do you have decks, for example, or things around your house that go from that small ignitable components up to bigger pieces of wood, up to bigger pieces of wood, up to bigger pieces of wood, which may be your house, okay? So think of it as a campfire and start taking away those combustible materials that could easily ignite. I'm not going to go through all these in details, but again, the studies that NIST and IBHS are doing are looking at all the components of the roof for skylights, vents, the edges of roof, gutters, eaves, things like that. The vents for either at the top of your roof or the gable ends or under your eaves or around for your crawl spaces and all those kind of things. Those make big differences. If embers get through those vents and have the combustible properties to them, they can start igniting your wooden frame underneath. If you seal those up to the point where you have, some of you were looking at the black mesh that is out there. That's a mesh from a company in Australia called Bushfire Mesh. And that is, has actually just been tested and passed ASTM testing. And it is the only mesh that has ever passed the ASTM properties that no embers have gotten through it to go ahead and ignite something on the far side. So it's a very good property. I'm going to just quickly, again, another view of the embers and the testing that they're doing. 1/4-inch mesh allows embers to get through. The state regulations for housing in Chapter 7A right now requires there to be nothing larger than 1/8 inch. This black mesh is even less than that. But of course you need to make sure that, you know, if you have painters come and stuff, don't overspray it and paint it closed or something like that. The only reason that you have vents to begin with is to keep air circulation from, removing moisture from the enclosed portions of your house so that you don't get mold and mildew and things like that. So if you go ahead and change the mesh, see all the embers that are getting through it. If you reduce the size of the mesh, then the embers don't have a chance to get through and ignite something on the other side. So those are what we want to do. Anybody see any problems with this roof? It's none of yours. Trust me, I know where this was taken. It wasn't taken down here. It's in Mill Valley. That's as close as I'll get. But you can see all the needles and pine needles and things like that. And if that started burning, how would that affect the skylights and what that would happen? Again, this is that building. Again, that same building burning on the right there. They're looking at all these tests that they just... I am so jealous of Daniel and his cohorts that are all working there. They get to just go to work every day and burn things up. And I told him, I said, I can't believe you actually get paid to do this. But that is what they do. But we are learning so much from all the things that they're testing. They go also, IBHS is also testing all these other applications, whether it's paints, gels, stains, all these all these things that are out on the market to apply that are supposed to help reduce ignition properties. What they're discovering by just simply applying these things and putting them outside in the weather and then test them like a year later or even 6 months later, what they're discovering is that there are a lot of variabilities. And the variables revolve around solar exposure. So of course, if you're on a south-facing wall, it's not going to have a lot of longevity with these materials. If you're on a north-facing wall, it may last a little bit longer. But the main thing to think about is that once again, if you're relying on some kind of gel or paint or spray foam or something like that, that you may not have the time to do anyway. If a fire's coming, my guess is that my recommendation to all of you is to pack up and get out. Don't take the time to say, how long would it take you to spray foam your house? And the typical response is a couple of hours, if you do it correctly. And unfortunately, people who've taken the time to try and do it ahead of the fire, a couple of things happen. Number one is because none of us are really, I'm not going to say I don't know what all of you do, but I'm not a professionally trained foam applicator, okay? I don't know how to do it myself necessarily. I'm probably going to miss some spots in corners or under the eave or whatever, and those embers are going to find that spot that I missed, and that's the weak link that'll take the house down. And how long did it take me to put that foam on? And then how strong are the winds? You get 80, 100 mile an hour winds coming through. Is the foam really going to stay on your house and not blow away? And the answer is no. So the fact is that a lot of these things, I'm not saying they're bad products. And I'm not even going to suggest that they don't work. But the fact is, don't rely on that solely to be taking care of your problem. I'd recommend that you go ahead and do all the things like sealing corners up, using the right materials, all these kind of things. Do that first, and if you want to back it up with some additional materials like this, then that's sort of icing on the cake. Again, what kind of screens? Do you have screens at your house that are plastic, vinyl, or metal? Obviously, if you've got metal screens, they're the best, because they don't burn as readily or easily and they can resist a lot more heat. If you've got plastic screens or vinyl screens, of course they can melt. And so that exposes your window to more heat. And so you want to do this. This is a really important video to watch, and I want you to see, now this is a view of looking down at a deck, and this is like the wall of the house where it says the deck demo. That's the wall of the house, and this is a deck. And again, they just turned on the ember machine, and watch what happens when this starts blowing. See the swirling? See those embers just circling around? That is a demonstration that you can go look at around your own house. Have you ever walked around your house on a really windy day and you find those little pockets and corners and things where leaves and dust and debris are all swirling around in the corners? That's because your house sets up a series of vortexes that when wind starts blowing, it's just going to swirl around in those corners. And guess what? if you walk around your house and you look for those areas that where leaves and debris and litter and dust and things are swirling around, those are the exact same locations where the embers are going to do the same thing. So you really want to pay close attention to all the materials, all the joints, everything where those actions are happening on a windy day. When you start to see this, up here on the joint where the deck met the wall, you can begin to see little pieces of flaming fronts. And this was just a very, very quick demo. And already you're beginning to see some potential ignition happening at those joints. So what you want to do is start thinking about, could I put like a metal frame or a metal flashing or something to separate that deck from my vertical wall to go ahead and prevent that joint from ever igniting and burning your house. So those are the kind of things that we want to see people looking at and stuff like that. But again, next big windy day you've got, just walk around your house and take a look at where all those things are happening and address those areas. Those are important areas to pay attention to. Yes, sir. So the question is, if you have a house where those are likely to occur and leaves develop in the corners and around on decks and things, could you set up a sprinkler system to turn on and reduce the likelihood of ignitions? So we're getting just ahead just a tad bit, but I'll go ahead and address that. Sprinkler systems for homes are, I'm going to say the jury's out on them. And here's why. It's one of those things too, there's a lot of companies that make sprinkler systems, and once again, I'm not going to stand here and claim that they don't work or they don't have any value. I think that they're a good insurance policy to have, maybe if you've done everything else. Once again, if you've taken all the steps to harden your home and done your defensible space, and you want to put a sprinkler system up to give you some extra solutions to putting fires out, that might be a viable option, but there's two things wrong with it. One is that if you put a sprinkler system up, and now the wind's blowing 50, 80, 100 miles an hour, where's the water going to go? It's very unlikely that it's going to go where you want it to go. The wind's going to take it and just evaporate it and blow it someplace else. So it probably isn't going to do the job that you want it to do to begin with. The second thing that we've unfortunately seen time and time again, and we're seeing it a lot in fires today, is that the water supply systems in urban communities begin to fail very, very quickly. And why is that? Because you've now got hundreds, if not thousands of firefighters arriving on scene, all hooking up to hydrants and sucking water out of the system, right? In addition, unfortunately, you may have hundreds, if not thousands of structures all being destroyed at the same time. If a house or a commercial building starts burning and burns down to the ground, there is no automatic shutoff. They all have a water line coming in to provide water to that building, right? And when that house burns down, the water line is still there and the water's just flowing. There's nothing turning it off. And so think about the possibility of people plugging in sprinkler systems, and the unfortunate reality is that that's just helping to deplete the water supply that much faster, with likely not very much help in putting the water where you want it to go to begin with. Now again, I'm not going to suggest that it's not valuable or useful. There's lots of different types of fires. What we're talking about here are the most extreme, serious fires, right? But those are a small percentage. The vast majority of fires are the smaller, more controllable, easier fires that maybe a sprinkler system could have some value on it. But if you are in a position where you live remotely and you have your own private, healthy, good water supply, then I say knock yourself out. It's your water, you can do what you want with it. But in an urban situation with public water supplies, we see those water systems begin to fail very quickly. So Using sprinklers on structures is not necessarily recommended unless you can supply the water on your own. And if you have a pool or something like that, that's entirely possible. So again, we're looking at decks and where the embers start to ignite at the joints. This is that view of the deck. Now this is what IBHS has discovered. I think this is really brilliant, and I've talked to the researchers that came up with this. If you're outside standing on top of the deck, you may only see this little bit of flame burning on top of the deck. That's what you see. But underneath that, you're seeing what's on the left. And you don't see that big fire from standing on top of the deck. You see it underneath the deck. And that's why if you put some kind of a foil joint, it will help prevent that fire from going up into those deck boards and start to burn the joists and the decks. So that's where they came up with that idea, is that they started playing with it and using that, and it worked remarkably well. It's not a code requirement yet because they still don't know enough about it. But again, look at what we're talking about, fences. This is an actual example of some photos I took. This was after the glass fire in 2020 that burned started in Napa County, jumped the entire Napa Valley in the evening and burned all the way through the hills to Santa Rosa that evening. And this was a subdivision where a number of homes were burned. But look at what happened here. See the path of the fire on the fence to the right? Went right to the house. Fortunately, one of the fire crews came by, began to see the impact that it was having on the wall there on the left, and were able to knock it down and keep that house from burning. And look at what else they did. They have this lovely bark mulched landscaping, right? Look what they did. Somebody frantically went through and started raking all the bark mulch away from the house. Wouldn't it have been nice if they'd done that before the fire started? And so these are the kind of things, and you can see the burning in the background. On the other side of this house, of course, there are more wooden fences that actually traveled uphill to neighboring houses and burned them down. And so again, these fence issues are very, very real. And so what to do about it? I'm not suggesting that you remove all the wooden fences, but what if this section of the fence had been of a different material that was non-combustible? Whether it be metal or chain link or, concrete, whatever. I mean, think about different materials, and if this fire had reached this portion of the fence that can't burn, then it would have never done that because the fire can't get to the house. So those are the things you want to think about. Break that path. There's been studies for new construction showing that the cost of building to fire-resilient structures is actually comparable or even less than what new structures, than what non-combustible structures are, the typical home versus the wildfire-resistant home. And the reason is because, and you start getting better energy efficiencies with it and longer longevity of the materials and things like that. So the myth that all of this costs so much more, if you're building new, is simply not true. It does, however, change if you're doing retrofitting. And this is where, I'm not going to lie to you, retrofitting costs more money. It is difficult and it's expensive to go ahead and retrofit. But I would argue the fact that we need to think about these things and recognize the fact that, look, folks, we didn't get into this mess overnight. I mean, this has been 100, 150 years of evolution of building up to this, and we're not going to change it overnight. So if you can start doing little things here and there when you can, as you can afford them, eventually we'll reach a point where we've built a more fire-resistant community. Okay? Anyway, this is again statistics of, you can see the campfire has by far the most destruction of the structures. This is the statistics since we started keeping those statistics on the damaged structures. The majority of structures that are being destroyed today are actually occurring in LRA, in the local responsibility areas, which kind of makes sense, right? I mean, if you get a town the size of Paradise or the entire community of Coffey Park, those are all incorporated in towns, right? So the vast majority of structures that are burning today are actually burning in LRA, not SRA. This is a little complex slide to read, but the fact that this brings up is that when the Wildland-Urban Interface Code came into play, it was put into effect in 2008. That's when the state enacted that. In 2008, so for all the fires and all these statistics that we do, we've kind of looked at it in two ways. We've taken the information and we've said, let's look at all the damaged and destroyed structures that were built before 2008 and those that were built after 2008. And what it shows universally across the board is that the structures that were built after 2008 have a higher rate of survivability. So that means the codes are working. They actually are being able to make newer structures survive. So these materials and the codes that are dictating how we build in these wildland areas can actually work. This is another statistic that just shows that the number of structures that are damaged and destroyed occur very quickly in fires. Usually within the first 24 hours, the majority of structures have already been destroyed. That kind of makes sense too because the winds change, right? Winds typically don't just go on at those high speeds day after day after day after day. They usually have these high wind periods for several hours, maybe a day, and then it dies down a little bit. So the vast majority of structures being destroyed are during the first day. Let's see, we'll just go on with this. This is again one of our maps that we produced, and this is actually in Paradise. And you can see all those red dots were homes that were destroyed. You can see a scattering here and there of some green ones that survived. But if any of you have been up to Paradise and seen what happened up there, it's pretty sobering to look at the vast amount of structure loss up there. This is the same type of map for Coffee Park. So again, Coffee Park is almost all rebuilt, but it was in the city of Santa Rosa and it didn't even exist in a hazard zone. It wasn't even identified as any kind of hazard at all. In this map, you see the Highway 101 corridor going through Santa Rosa right here, and you see the moderate zone in the state responsibility area to the east of the highway, but the hazard severity zones didn't even travel into Coffee Park. And that was the big, in fact, the maps were almost done being reviewed at that point, and when Coffee Park was destroyed, it made everybody take a second thought and say, I think we need to reanalyze this. Because nobody expected a community like that far away from a wildfire area to actually be destroyed. What happened here is that where you see the LRA sign, that little red dot right there, that's where the Kmart was. And guess what all these big stores have? They've got garden centers with lots of plants sitting right next to their structure, okay? So the garden center caught on fire and Kmart was destroyed. Adjacent to that was there was a furniture store, an Applebee's, Chevron, all these structures started burning. The winds were blowing this direction and the embers got into Coffee Park, and that's what started the fire in Coffee Park, were the embers from all those structures. So let's just very quickly, we're going to go into some hazard mitigation methodology. I think I'm running behind schedule, aren't I? Just a little bit? Okay, so again, what we're looking at, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about a lot of this, but we're looking at the differences between low density housing versus dense housing, and what are the changes that we need to address when we do those kind of things. This is an important slide I want you to take away too. When we're looking at the exposure, again, we're looking at removing, reducing, or relocating things to change that exposure and change the risk. In addition, we're looking at hardening the structure. And based on where you live, how close you may be to neighbors, on what type of topography, think of them as like knobs on your stove that you're adjusting the heat, okay? You want to find just the right setting that will both harden your structure enough and change your exposure enough to remove the likelihood that embers can catch your house on fire. So think of those two things as adjustable knobs, and you want to find just the right Goldilocks balance just for your house on your piece of property. And it will be different a little bit for probably everybody in this room, because we don't all have the same houses. We're not all sitting in the same property. And so you have to make those adjustments based on what works for you. And so that's where you need to learn about this stuff. Again, the mitigation methodology, they're looking at the studies. These are, again, examples from Paradise. This residence here did a great job of moving their auxiliary structure far away from their house to protect it. Right? They did a really great job. But what happened is the wood fence caught on fire and destroyed the neighbor's house. Okay? So those are the things. What you're doing on your property affects everybody else. Fences again. And where these, sheds are and gazebos and things, looking at where the fuels are and how they're going to affect it. This is another example up in Paradise. And again, the neighbors here put their gazebo far away to keep it away from their house. Great job. But the gazebo caught fire, caught the fence on fire, which traveled around, caught the RV on fire because the RV was parked right next to the fence. The RV caught the deck on fire, and the deck burned the house down. So there was your path, going all the way over to the neighbor's house. Yes, sir? The question is there a liability issue? Not really. At least not yet. Because we haven't exactly quantified this. If you're going to suggest things like that, the liability has to be dictated that you can't put things there, or you have to use certain materials and stuff. And then if you don't follow those rules, then there could be some liability, but we're a long way from that yet. New housing developments, we have to get better at thinking about where we're placing structures. Can we build structures this close together? I'm going to argue yes. There are new materials, there's new building products out there that are highly non-combustible. And that if we use newer materials that don't burn, then we can go ahead and build close together like this with very little impact. So we need to think about those things. Again, those two knobs that are talking about stuff. Are you pulling me off stage? Our structure separation distance, just again, studying where these go and what is igniting structures. Again, the gazebo to the fence to the house, all those kind of things. And, looking at the larger landscape and how they interconnect to your neighbors' homes and things like that. I think I'm getting pulled off here, so I apologize. Oh, and so one of the things that we want to mention, Santa Barbara County here has actually done an amazing job. They have just built a website that is now live on the Santa Barbara Fire Safe Council link that you can go on, and they have a whole lot of these things. I'm embarrassed to say it stars me. So I have a lot of little talks about these kind of things, like just short little snippets, 2 or 3 minutes of talking about vents and windows and fences and the combustible space around homes. So I encourage you to go look at those things, and it has a lot of information about where you can find more information about those kind of things. But it's one of the best sites that I've seen any Fire Safe Council in the state do. I sit on the board of directors for the State Fire Safe Council, so I have touch bases with a lot of Fire Safe Councils, and they're one of the best here. So round of applause for all of them.
All right, thank you, Dave. And if anyone has questions for Dave, he'll be here hopefully the rest of the day. He is also giving a talk about insurance at 2, so if anyone is on the Zoom link right now or the live stream link, we have to shut that off and switch to the next one for his insurance talk at 2. But Dave, if you want to take a break, if you guys want to take a break, he'll also be here for questions, or you guys can ask questions now, whatever you want. But feel free to stretch your legs. But we're having a really great talk about insurance starting at 2. I'm sure it's impacting a lot of you in this room, so if you want to stick around, please do. He's very, 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 very knowledgeable about insurance. I've learned so much from him. And one last thing, we do have Ethan's exhibit open. There's an event workshop survey in the folders we gave you. If you filled it out and return it to us, you get 2 more free raffle tickets, so please do that. I really, really appreciate your feedback as we improve upon these presentations. We want to do them more and more. All right, thanks everyone. Thanks,